The word reality is however used in another acceptation to mean that something behaves conformably to its essential characteristic or notion. For example, we use the expression, this is a real occupation, this is a real man. Here the term does not merely mean outward and immediate existence, but rather that some existence agrees with its notion. In which sense, be it added, reality is not distinct from the ideality which we shall in the first instance become acquainted with in the shape of being for self. Section 92, beta, being, if kept distinct and apart from its determinate mode, as it is in being by self, being implicit, would be only the vacant abstraction of being. In being, determinate there and then, the determinateness is one with being. Yet at the same time, when explicitly made a negation, it is a limit, a barrier. Hence the otherness is not something indifferent and outside it, but a function proper to it. Somewhat is by its quality, firstly finite, secondly alterable, so that finitude and variability appertain to its being. In being there and then, the negation is still directly one with the being, and this negation is what we call a limit, boundary. A thing is what it is, only in and by reason of its limit. We cannot therefore regard the limit as only external to being which is then and there. It rather goes through and through the whole of such existence. The view of limit, as merely an external characteristic of being there and then, arises from a confusion of quantitative with qualitative limit. Here we are speaking primarily of the qualitative limit. If, for example, we observe a piece of ground, 3 acres large, that circumstance is its quantitative limit. But, in addition, the ground is, it may be, a meadow, not a wood or a pond. This is its qualitative limit. Man, if he wishes to be actual, must be there and then, and to this end he must set a limit to himself. People who are too fastidious towards the finite never reach actuality, but linger lost in abstraction, and their light dies away. If we take a closer look at what a limit implies, we see it involving a contradiction in itself, and thus evincing its dialectical nature. On the one side limit makes the reality of a thing, on the other it is its negation. But, again, the limit, as the negation of something, is not an abstract nothing but a nothing which is, what we call an other. Given something, and up starts an other to us. We know that there is. Being. 239. Not something only, but an other as well. Nor, again, is the other of such a nature that we can think something apart from it. A something is implicitly the other of itself, and the somewhat sees its limit become objective to it in the other. If we now ask for the difference between something and another, it turns out that they are the same, which sameness is expressed in Latin by calling the pair aliad aliad. The other, as opposed to the something, is itself a something, and hence we say some other, or something else, and so on the other hand the first something when opposed to the other, also defined as something, is itself another. When we say, something else, our first impression is that something taken separately is only something, and that the quality of being another attaches to it only from outside considerations. Thus we suppose that the moon, being something else than the sun, might very well exist without the sun. But really the moon, as a something, has its other implicit in it. Plato says, God made the world out of the nature of the one, and the other, ton hetero, having brought these together, he formed from them a third, which is of the nature of the one, and the other. In these words we have in general terms a statement of the nature of the finite, which, as something, does not meet the nature of the other as if it had no affinity to it, but, being implicitly the other of itself, thus undergoes alteration. Alteration thus exhibits the inherent contradiction which originally attaches to determinate being, and which forces it out of its own bounds. To materialized conception existence stands in the character of something solely positive, and quietly abiding within its own limits. Though we also know, it is true, that everything finite, such as existence, is subject to change. Such changeableness in existence is to the superficial eye a mere possibility, the realization of which is not a consequence of its own nature. But the fact is, mutability lies in the notion of existence, and change is only the manifestation of what it implicitly is. The living die, simply because as living they bear in themselves the germ of death. Section 93. Something becomes an other. This other is itself somewhat, therefore it likewise becomes an other, and so on ad infinitum. Section 94. This infinity is the wrong or negative infinity. It is only a negation of a finite, but the finite rises again the same as ever, and is never got rid of and absorbed. In other words, this infinite only expresses the ought-to-be elimination of the finite. The progression to infinity never gets further. 240. Hegel's logic. Then a statement of the contradiction involved in the finite, viz. that it is somewhat as well as somewhat else. It sets up with endless iteration the alternation between these two terms, each of which calls up the other. If we let somewhat and another, the elements of determinate being, fall asunder, the result is that some becomes other, and this other is itself a somewhat, which then as such changes likewise, and so on ad infinitum. This result seems to superficial reflection something very grand, the grandest possible. But such a progression to infinity is not the real infinite. That consists in being at home with itself in its other, or, if enunciated as a process, in coming to itself in its other. Much depends on rightly apprehending the notion of infinity, and not stopping short at the wrong infinity of endless progression. When time and space, for example, are spoken of as infinite, it is in the first place the infinite progression on which our thoughts fasten. We say, now, this time, and then we keep continually going forwards and backwards beyond this limit. The case is the same with space, the infinity of which has formed the theme of barren declamation to astronomers with a talent for edification. In the attempt to contemplate such an infinite, our thought, we are commonly informed, must sink exhausted. It is true indeed that we must abandon the unending contemplation, not however because the occupation is too sublime, but because it is too tedious. It is tedious to expatiate in the contemplation of this infinite progression, because the same thing is constantly recurring. We lay down a limit. Then we pass it. Next we have a limit once more, and so on forever. All this is but superficial alternation, which never leaves the region of the finite behind. To suppose that by stepping out and away into that infinity we release ourselves from the finite, is in truth but to seek the release which comes by flight. But the man who flees is not yet free, in fleeing he is still conditioned by that from which he flees. If it be also said that the infinite is unattainable, the statement is true, but only because to the idea of infinity has been attached the circumstance of being simply and solely negative. With such empty and otherworld stuff philosophy has nothing to do. What philosophy has to do with is always something concrete and in the highest sense present. No doubt philosophy has also sometimes been set the task of finding an answer to the question, how the infinite comes to the resolution of issuing out of itself. This question, founded, as it is, upon the assumption of a rigid opposition between finite and infinite, may be answered by saying that the opposition is false, and that in point of fact the infinite eternally proceeds out of itself, and yet does not proceed out of being. 241. Itself. If we further say that the infinite is the not finite, we have in point of fact virtually expressed the truth, for as the finite itself is the first negative, the not finite is the negative of that negation, the negation which is identical with itself and thus at the same time a true affirmation. The infinity of reflection here discussed is only an attempt to reach the true infinity, a wretched neither one thing nor another. Generally speaking, it is the point of view which has in recent times been MPHA-sized in Germany. The finite, this theory tells us, ought to be absorbed, the infinite ought not to be a negative merely, but also a positive. That, ought to be, betrays the incapacity of actually making good a claim which is at the same time recognized to be right. This stage was never passed by the systems of Kant and Fichte, so far as ethics are concerned. The utmost to which this way brings us is only the postulate of a never-ending approximation to the law of reason. Which postulate has been made an argument for the immortality of the soul. Section 95, Gamma. What we now in point of fact have before us, is that somewhat comes to be an other, and that the other generally comes to be an other. Thus essentially relative to another, somewhat is virtually an other against it. And since what is passed into is quite the same as what passes over, since both have one and the same attribute, viz. to be an other, it follows that something in its passage into other only joins with itself. To be thus self-related in the passage, and in the other, is the genuine infinity. Or, under a negative aspect, what is altered is the other, it becomes the other of the other. Thus being, but as negation of the negation, is restored again, it is now being for self. Dualism, in putting an insuperable opposition between finite and infinite, fails to note the simple circumstance that the infinite is thereby only one of two, and is reduced to a particular, to which the finite forms the other particular. Such an infinite, which is only a particular, as conterminous with the finite which makes for it a limit and a barrier. It is not what it ought to be, that is, the infinite, but is only finite. In such circumstances, where the finite is on this side, and the infinite on that this world is the finite in the other world is the infinite and equal dignity of permanence and independence is ascribed to finite and to infinite. The being of the finite is made an absolute being, and by this dualism gets independent. 242. Hegel's logic. Ens and stability. Touched, so to speak, by the infinite, it would be annihilated. But it must not be touched by the infinite. There must be an abyss, an impassable gulf between the two, with the infinite abiding on yonder side and the finite steadfast on this. Those who attribute to the finite this inflexible persistence in comparison with the infinite are not, as they imagine, far above metaphysic. They are still on the level of the most ordinary metaphysic of understanding. For the same thing occurs here as in the infinite progression. At one time it is admitted that the finite has no independent actuality, no absolute being, no root and development of its own, but is only a transient. But next moment this is straightway forgotten. The finite, made a mere counterpart to the infinite, wholly separated from it, and rescued from annihilation, as conceived to be persistent in its independence. While thought thus imagines itself elevated to the infinite, it meets with the opposite fate. It comes to an infinite which is only a finite, and the finite, which it had left behind, has always to be retained and made into an absolute. After this examination, with which it were well to compare, Plato's Philebus, tending to show the nullity of the distinction made by understanding between the finite and the infinite, we are liable to glide into the statement that the infinite and the finite are therefore one, and that the genuine infinity, the truth, must be defined and enunciated as the unity of the finite and infinite. Such a statement would be to some extent correct, but is just as open to perversion and falsehood as the unity of being and nothing already noticed. Besides, it may very fairly be charged with reducing the infinite to finitude and making a finite infinite. For, so far as the expression goes, the finite seems left in its place it is not expressly stated to be absorbed. Or, if we reflect that the finite, when identified with the infinite, certainly cannot remain what it was out of such unity, and will at least suffer some change in its characteristics, as an alkali, when combined with an acid, loses some of its properties. We must see that the same fate awaits the infinite, which, as the negative, will on its part likewise have its edge, as it were, taken off on the other. And this does really happen with the abstract one-sided infinite of understanding. The genuine infinite, however, is not merely in the position of the one-sided acid, and so does not lose itself. The negation of negation is not a neutrally sation. The infinite is the affirmative, and it is only the finite which is absorbed. Being. 243. In being for self enters the category of ideality. Being there and then, as in the first instance apprehended in its being or affirmation, has reality, section 91, and thus even finitude in the first instance is in the category of real ity. But the truth of the finite is rather its ideality. Similarly, the infinite of understanding, which is coordinated with the finite, is itself only one of two finites, no whole truth, but a non-substantial element. This ideality of the finite is the chief maxim of philosophy, and for that reason every genuine philosophy is idealism. But everything depends upon not taking for the infinite what, in the very terms of its characterization, is at the same time made a particular and finite. For this reason we have bestowed a greater amount of attention on this distinction. The fundamental notion of philosophy, the genuine infinite, depends upon it. The distinction is cleared up by the simple, and for that reason seemingly insignificant, but incontrovertible reflections contained in the first paragraph of this section. C. Being for self. Section 96. Alpha. Being for self, as reference to itself, is immediacy, and as reference of the negative to itself, is a self-subsistent, the one. This unit, being without distinction in itself, thus excludes the other from itself. To be for self, to be one, as completed quality, and as such, contains abstract being and being modified as non-substantial elements. As simple being, the one is simple self-reference, as being modified it is determinate, but the determinateness is not in this case a finite determinateness, a somewhat in distinction from an other, but infinite, because it contains distinction absorbed and annulled in itself. The readiest instance of being for self is found in the I. We know ourselves as existence, distinguished in the first place from other existents, and with certain relations thereto. But we also come to know this expansion of existence, in these relations, reduced, as it were, to a point in the simple form of being for self. When we say, I, we express this reference to self which is infinite, and at the same time negative. Man, it may be said, is distinguished from the animal world, and in that way from our nature altogether, by knowing himself as I, which amounts to saying that natural things never attain free being for self, but as limited to being there and then, are always and only being for another. 244. Hegel's logic. Again, being for self may be described as ideality, just as being there and then was described as reality. It is said that besides reality there is also an ideality. Thus the two categories are made equal and parallel. Properly speaking, ideality is not somewhat outside of and beside real ity. The notion of ideality just lies in its being the truth of reality. That is to say, when reality is explicitly put as what it implicitly is, it is at once seen to be ideality. Hence ideality has not received its proper estimation, when you allow that reality is not all in all, but that an ideality must be recognized outside of it. Such an ideality, external to or it may even be beyond reality, would be no better than an empty name. Ideal ity only has a meaning when it is the ideality of something, but this something is not a mere indefinite this or that, but existence character ised is reality, which, if retained in isolation, possesses no truth. The distinction between nature and mind is not improperly conceived, when the former is traced back to reality, and the latter so fixed and complete as to subsist even without mind. In mind it first, as it were, attains its goal and its truth. And similarly, mind on its part is not merely a world beyond nature and nothing more. It is really, and with full proof, seen to be mind, only when it involves nature as absorbed in itself. Apropos of this, we should note the double meaning of the German word aufheben, to put by or set aside. We mean by it, 1. To clear away, or annul. Thus, we say, a law or regulation is set aside. 2. To keep, or preserve, in which sense we use it when we say, something is well put by. This double usage of language, which gives to the same word a positive and negative meaning, is not an accident, and gives no ground for reproaching language as a cause of confusion. We should rather recognize in it the speculative spirit of our language rising above the mere, either or, of understanding. Section 97. Beta. The relation of the negative to itself is a negative relation, and so a distinguishing of the one from itself, the repulsion of the one. That is, it makes many ones. So far as regards the immediacy of the self-existence, these many are, and the repulsion of every one of them becomes to that extent their repulsion against each other as existing units, in other words, their reciprocal exclusion. Whenever we speak of the one, the many usually come into our mind at the same time. Whence, then, we are forced to ask, do the many come? This question is unanswerable by the consciousness which picturish the many as a primary datum, and treats the one as only one. Being. 245. Among the many. But the philosophic notion teaches, contrariwise, that the one forms the presupposition of the many, and in the thought of the one is implied that it explicitly make itself many. The self-existing unit is not, like being, void of all connective reference. It is a reference, as well as being there and then was, not however a reference connecting somewhat with another, but as unity of some in the other. It is a connection with itself, and this connection, be it noted, is a negative connection. Hereby the one manifests an utter incompatibility with itself, a self-repulsion, and what makes itself explicitly be, is the many. We may denote this side in the process of being for self by the figurative term repulsion. Repulsion is a term originally employed in the study of matter, to mean that matter, as a many, in each of these many ones, behaves as exclusive to all the others. It would be wrong however to view the process of repulsion as if the one were the repellent and the many the repelled. The one, as already remarked, just as self-exclusion and explicit putting itself as the many. Each of the many however is itself a one, and in virtue of its so behaving, this all-rounded repulsion is by one stroke converted into its opposite, attraction. ATTRA Court IONANDREPLSION Section 98, Gamma. But the many are one the same as another. Each is one, or even one of the many. They are consequently one and the same. Or when we study all that repulsion involves, we see that as a negative attitude of many ones to one another, it is just as essentially a connective reference of them to each other. And as those to which the one is related in its act of repulsion are ones, it is in them thrown into relation with itself. The repulsion therefore has an equal right to be called attraction, and the exclusive one, or being for self, suppresses itself. The qualitative character, which in the one or unit has reached the extreme point of its characterization, has thus passed over into determinateness, quality, suppressed, i.e. into being as quantity. The philosophy of the atomists is the doctrine in which the absolute is formulated as being for self, as one, and many ones. And it is the repulsion, which shows itself in the notion of the one, which is assumed as the fundamental force in these atoms. But instead of attraction, it is accident, that is, mere unintelligence, which is expected to bring them together. So long as the one is fixed as one, it is certainly impossible to regard its congression with others as anything but external and mechanical. 246. Hegel's logic. Cal. The void, which is assumed as the complementary principle to the atoms, is repulsion in nothing else, presented under the image of the nothing existing between the atoms. Modern atomism, and physics is still in principle atomistic, has surrendered the atom so far as to pin its faith on molecules or particles. In doing so, science has come closer to sensuous conception, at the cost of losing the precision of thought. To put an attractive by the side of a repulsive force, as the moderns have done, certainly gives completeness to the contrast, and the discovery of this natural force, as it is called, has been a source of much pride. But the mutual implication of the two, which makes what is true and concrete in them, would have to be wrested from the obscurity and confusion in which they were left even in Kant's metaphysical rudiments of natural science. In modern times, the importance of the atomic theory is even more evident in political than in physical science. According to it, the will of individuals is such as the creative principle of the state, the attracting force is the special wants and inclinations of individuals, and the universal, or the state itself, is the external nexus of a compact. 1. The atomic philosophy forms a vital stage in the historical evolution of the idea. The principle of that system may be described as being for itself in the shape of the many. At present, students of Nature who are anxious to avoid metaphysics turn a favorable ear to atomism. But it is not possible to escape metaphysics and cease to trace nature back to terms of thought, by throwing ourselves into the arms of atomism. The atom, in fact, is itself a thought, and hence the theory which holds matter to consist of atoms is a metaphysical theory. Newton gave physics an express warning to beware of metaphysics, it is true, but to his honor be it said, he did not by any means obey his own warning. The only mere physicists are the animals. They alone do not think, while man is a thinking being and a born metaphysician. The real question is not whether we shall apply metaphysics, but whether our metaphysics are of the right kind. In other words, whether we are not, instead of the concrete logical idea, adopting one-sided forms of thought, rigidly fixed by understanding, and making these the basis of our theoretical as well as our practical work. It is on this ground that one objects to the atomic philosophy. The old atomists viewed the world as a many, as their successors of 10 do to this day. On chance they laid the task of collecting the atoms which float about in the void. But, after all, the nexus binding the being. 247. Many with one another is by no means a mere accident, as we have already remarked, the nexus founded on their very nature. To Kant we owe the completed theory of matter as the unity of repulsion and attraction. The theory is correct, so far as it recognizes attraction to be the other of the two elements involved in the notion of being for self, and to be an element no less essential than repulsion to constitute matter. Still, this dynamic construction of matter, as it is termed, has the fault of taking for granted, instead of deducing, attraction and repulsion. Had they been deduced, we should then have seen the how and why of a unity which is merely asserted. Kant insisted that matter must be regarded as consisting solely in their unity. German physicists for some time accepted this pure dynamic. But in spite of this, the majority of these physicists in modern times have found it more convenient to return to the atomic point of view, and in spite of the warnings of Kastner, one of their number, have begun to regard matter as consisting of infinitesimally small particles, termed atoms, which atoms have then to be brought into relation with one another by the play of forces attaching to them attractive, repulsive, or whatever they may be. This too is metaphysics, and metaphysics which, for its utter unintelligence, there would be sufficient reason to guard against. Quantitandquality. 2. The transition from quality to quantity, indicated in the paragraph before us, is not found in our ordinary way of thinking, which deems each of these categories to exist independently beside the other. We are in the habit of saying that things are not merely qualitatively, but also quantitatively defined, but whence these categories originate, and how they are related to each other, are questions not further examined. The fact is, quantity just means quality superseded and absorbed, and it is by the dialectic of quality here examined that this supersession is effected. First of all, we had being, as the truth of being, came becoming, which formed the passage into being determinate, and the truth of that we found to be alteration. And in its result alteration showed itself to be being for self. Finally, in the two sides of the process, repulsion and attraction, was clearly seen to annul itself, and thereby to annul quality in the totality of its stages. Still this superseded and absorbed quality is neither an abstract no thing, nor an equally abstract and featureless being. It is only being as indifferent to determinateness or character. This aspect of being is also 248. Hegel's logic. What appears as quantity in our ordinary conceptions? We observe things, first of all, with an eye to their quality, which we take to be the character identical with the being of the thing. If we proceed to consider their quantity, we get the conception of an indifferent and external character or mode, of such a kind that a thing remains what it is, though its quantity is altered, and the thing becomes greater or less. B. Quantity. A. Pure quantity. Section 99. Quantity is pure being, where the mode or character is no longer taken as one with the being itself, but explicitly put as superseded or indifferent. 1. The expression magnitude especially marks determinate quantity, and is for that reason not a suitable name for quantity in general. 2. Mathematics usually define magnitude as what can be increased or diminished. This definition has the defect of containing the thing to be defined over again, but it may serve to show that the category of magnitude is explicitly understood to be changeable and indifferent, so that, in spite of its being altered by an increased extension or intension, the thing, a house, for example, does not cease to be a house, and red to be red. 3. The absolute is pure quantity. This point of view is on the whole the same as when the absolute is defined to be matter, in which, though form undoubtedly is present, the form is a characteristic of no importance one way or another. Quantity too constitutes the main characteristic of the absolute, when the absolute is regarded as absolute indifference, and only admitting of quantitative distinction. Otherwise pure space, time, etc., may be taken as examples of quantity. If we allow ourselves to regard the real as whatever fills up space and time, it matters not with what. The mathematical definition of magnitude as what may be increased or diminished, appears at first sight to be more plausible and perspicuous than the exposition of the notion in the present section. When closely examined, however, it involves, under cover of presuppositions and images, the same elements as appear in the notion of quantity reached by the method of logical development. In other words, when we say that the notion of magnitude lies in the possibility of being increased or diminished, we state that magnitude, or more correctly, quantity, as being 249. Distinguished from quality, is a characteristic of such kind that the characterized thing is not in the least affected by any change in it. What then, it may be asked, is the fault which we have to find with this definition? It is that to increase and to diminish is the same thing as to characterize magnitude otherwise. If this aspect then were an adequate account of it, quantity would be described merely as whatever can be altered. But quality is no less than quantity open to alteration, and the distinction here given between quantity and quality is expressed by saying increase or diminution. The meaning being that, towards whatever side the determination of magnitude be altered, the thing still remains what it is. One remark more. Throughout philosophy we do not seek merely for correct, still less for plausible definitions, whose correctness appeals directly to the popular imagination. We seek approved or verified definitions, the content of which is not assumed merely as given, but as seen and known to warrant itself, because warranted by the free self-evolution of thought. To apply this to the present case, however correct and self-evident the definition of quantity usual in mathematics may be, it will still fail to satisfy the wish to see how far this particular thought is founded in universal thought, and in that way necessary. This difficulty, however, is not the only one. If quantity is not reached through the action of thought, but taken uncritically from our generalized image of it, we are liable to exaggerate the range of its validity, or even to raise it to the height of an absolute category. And that such a danger is real, we see when the title of exact science is restricted to those sciences the objects of which can be submitted to mathematical calculation. Here we have another trace of the bad metaphysics, mentioned in section 98n, which replace the concrete idea by partial and inadequate categories of understanding. Our knowledge would be in a very awkward predicament if such objects as freedom, law, morality, or even God himself, because they cannot be measured and calculated, or expressed in a mathematical formula, were to be reckoned beyond the reach of exact knowledge, and we had to put up with a vague generalized image of them, leaving their details or particulars to the pleasure of each individual, to make out of them what he will. The pernicious consequences, to which such a theory gives rise in practice, are at once evident. And this mere mathematical view, which identifies with the idea one of its special stages, viz. Quantity, is no other than the principle of materialism. Witness the history of the scientific modes of thought, especially in France since the mid-DLE of last century. Matter in the abstract is just what, though of course. 250. Hegel's logic. There is form in it, has that form only as an indifferent and external attribute. The present explanation would be utterly misconceived if it were supposed to disparage mathematics. By calling the quantitative characteristic merely external and indifferent, we provide no excuse for indolence and superficiality, nor do we assert that quantitative characteristics may be left to mind themselves, or at least require no very careful handling. Quantity, of course, is a stage of the idea, and as such it must have its due, first as a logical category, and then in the world of objects, natural as well as spiritual. Still, even so, there soon emerges the different importance attaching to the category of quantity according as its objects belong to the natural or to the spiritual world. For in nature, where the form of the idea is to be other than, and at the same time outside, itself, greater importance is for that very reason attached to quantity than in the spiritual world, the world of free inwardness. No doubt we regard even spiritual facts under a quantitative point of view, but it is at once apparent that in speaking of God as a trinity, the number 3 has by no means the same prominence, as when we consider the 3 dimensions of space or the 3 sides of a triangle, the fundamental feature of which last is just to be a surface bounded by 3 lines. Even inside the realm of nature we find the same distinction of greater or less importance of quantitative features. In the inorganic world, quantity plays, so to say, a more prominent part than in the organic. Even in organic nature, when we distinguish mechanical functions from what are called chemical, and in the narrower sense physical, there is the same difference. Mechanics is of all branches of science, confessedly, that in which the aid of mathematics can be least dispensed with, where indeed we cannot take one step without them. On that account mechanics is regarded, next to mathematics, as the science par excellence, which leads us to repeat the remark about the coincidence of the materialist with the exclusively mathematical point of view. After all that has been said, we cannot but hold it, in the interest of exact and thorough knowledge, one of the most hurtful prejudices, to seek all distinction and determinateness of objects merely in quantitative considerations. Mind, to be sure, is more than nature, and the animal is more than the plant. But we know very little of these objects and the distinction between them, if a more and less is enough for us, and if we do not proceed to comprehend them in their peculiar, that is, their qualitative character. Being. 251. Section 100. Quantity, as we saw, has 2 sources, the exclusive unit, and the identify cation or equalization of these units. When we look therefore at its immediate relation to self, or at the characteristic of self-sameness made explicit by attraction, quantity is continuous magnitude. But when we look at the other characteristic, the one implied in it, it is discrete magnitude. Still, continuous quantity has also a certain discreteness, being but a continuity of the many, and discrete quantity is no less continuous, its continuity being the one or unit, that is, the self-same point of the many ones. 1. Continuous and discrete magnitude, therefore, must not be supposed 2 species of magnitude, as if the characteristic of the one did not attach to the other. The only distinction between them is that the same whole, of quantity, is at one time explicitly put under the one, at another under the other of its characteristics. 2. The antinomy of space, of time, or of matter, which discusses the question of their being divisible forever, or of consisting of indivisible units, just means that we maintain quantity as at one time discrete, at another continuous. If we explicitly invest time, space, or matter with the attribute of continuous quantity alone, they are divisible ad infinitum. When, on the contrary, they are invested with the attribute of discrete quantity, they are potentially divided already, and consist of indivisible units. The one view is as inadequate as the other. Quantity, as the proximate result of being for self, involves the 2 sides in the process of the latter, attraction and repulsion, as constitutive elements of its own idea. It is consequently continuous as well as discrete. Each of these 2 elements involves the other also, and hence there is no such thing as a merely continuous or a merely discrete quantity. We may speak of the 2 as 2 particular and opposite species of magnitude, but that is merely the result of our abstracting reflection, which in viewing definite magnitudes waves now the one, now the other, of the elements contained in inseparable unity in the notion of quantity. Thus, it may be said, the space occupied by this room is a continuous magnitude and the 100 men assembled in it form a discrete magnitude. And yet the space is continuous and discrete at the same time, hence we speak of points of space, or we divide space, a certain length, into so many feet, inches, etc., which can be done only on the hypothesis that space is also potentially discrete. Similarly, on the other hand, the 252. Hegel's logic. Discrete magnitude, made up of 100 men, is also continuous. And the circumstance on which this continuity depends is the common element, the species man, which pervades all the individuals and unites them with each other. b. Quantum. How much, section 101. Quantity, essentially invested with the exclusionist character which it involves, as quantum, or how much, i.e. limited quantity. Quantum is, as it were, the determinate being of quantity, whereas mere quantity corresponds to abstract being, and the degree, which is next to be considered, corresponds to being for self. As for the details of the advance from mere quantity to quantum, it is founded on this: that while in mere quantity the distinction, as a distinction of continuity and discreteness, is at first only implicit, in a quantum the distinction is actually made, so that quantity in general now appears as distinguished or limited. But in this way the quantum breaks up at the same time into an indefinite multitude of quanta or definite magnitudes. Each of these definite magnitudes, as distinguished from the others, forms a unity, while on the other hand, viewed per se, it is a many. And, when that is done, the quantum is described as number. Section 102. In number the quantum reaches its development and perfect mode. Like the medium in which it exists, number involves two qualitative factors or functions, enumeration or sum, which depends on the factor discreteness, and unity, which depends on continuity. In arithmetic the several kinds of operation are usually presented as accidental modes of dealing with numbers. If necessary and meaning is to be found in these operations, it must be by a principle, and that must come from the characteristic element in the notion of number itself. This principle must here be briefly exhibited. These characteristic elements are enumeration on the one hand, and unity on the other, of which number is the unity. But this latter unity, when applied to empirical numbers, is only the equality of these numbers. Hence the principle of arithmetical operations must be to put numbers in the ratio of unity and sum, or amount, and to elicit the equality of these two modes. Being 253. The ones or the numbers themselves are indifferent towards each other, and hence the unity into which they are translated by the arithmetical operation takes the aspect of an external colligation. All reckoning is therefore making up the tale, and the difference between the species of it lies only in the qualitative constitution of the numbers of which we make up the tale. The principle for this constitution is given by the way we fix unity in enumeration. Numeration comes first. What we may call, making number, a colligation of as many units as we please. But to get a species of calculation, it is necessary that what we count up should be numbers already, and no longer a mere unit. First, and as they naturally come to hand, numbers are quite vaguely numbers in general, and so, on the whole, unequal. The colligation, or telling the tale of these, is addition. The second point of view under which we regard numbers is as equal, so that they make one unity, and of such there is an enumeration or sum before us. To tell the tale of these is multiplication. It makes no matter in the process, how the functions of sum and unity are distributed between the two numbers, or factors of the product. Either may be sum and either may be unity. The third and final point of view is the equality of sum, amount, and unity. To number together numbers when so characterized is involution, and in the first instance raising them to the square power. To raise the number to a higher power means in point of form to go on multiplying a number with itself an indefinite amount of times. Since this third type of calculation exhibits the complete equality of the sole existing distinction in number, viz. the distinction between sum or amount and unity, there can be no more than these three modes of calculation. Corresponding to the integration we have the dissolution of numbers according to the same features. Hence besides the three species mentioned, which may to that extent be called positive, there are three negative species of arithmetical operation. Number, in general, is the quantum in its complete specialization. Hence we may employ it not only to determine what we call discrete, but what are called continuous magnitudes as well. For that reason even geometry must call in the aid of number, when it is required to specify definite figurations of space and their ratios. 254. Hegel's logic. C. D. Egri section 103. The limit, in a quantum, is identical with the whole of the quantum itself. As in itself multiple, the limit is extensive magnitude, as in itself simple determinateness, qualitative simplicity, it is intensive magnitude or degree. The distinction between continuous and discrete magnitude differs from that between extensive and intensive in the circumstance that the former apply to quantity in general, while the latter apply to the limit or determinateness of it as such. Intensive and extensive magnitude are not, any more than the other, two species, of which the one involves a character not possessed by the other. What is extensive magnitude is just as much intensive, and vice versa. Intensive magnitude or degree is in its notion distinct from extensive magnitude or the quantum. It is therefore inadmissible to refuse, as many do, to recognize this distinction, and without scruple to identify the two forms of magnitude. They are so identified in physics, when difference of specific gravity is explained by saying that a body with a specific gravity twice that of another contains within the same space twice as many material parts, or atoms, as the other. So with heat and light, if the various degrees of temperature and brilliance were to be explained by the greater or less number of particles, or molecules, of heat and light. No doubt the physicists, who employ such a mode of explanation, usually excuse themselves, when they are remonstrated with on its untenableness, by saying that the expression is without prejudice to the confessedly unknowable essence of such phenomena, and employed merely for greater convenience. This greater convenience is meant to point to the easier application of the calculus, but it is hard to see why intensive magnitudes, having, as they do, a definite numerical expression of their own, should not be as convenient for calculation as extensive magnitudes. If convenience be all that is desired, surely it would be more convenient to banish calculation and thought altogether. A further point against the apology offered by the physicists is that to engage in explanations of this kind is to overstep the sphere of perception and experience, and resort to the realm of metaphysics and of what at other times would be called idle or even pernicious speculation. It is certainly a fact of experience that, if one of two purses filled with shillings is twice as heavy as the other, the raison must be, that the one contains, say, 200, and the other, being 255, only 100 shillings. These pieces of money we can see and feel with our senses, atoms, molecules, and the like, are on the contrary beyond the range of sensuous perception, and thought alone can decide whether they are admissible and have a meaning. But, as already noticed in section 98, note, it is abstract understanding which stereotypes the factor of multeity, involved in the notion of being for self in the shape of atoms, and adopts it as an ultimate principle. It is the same abstract understanding which, in the present instance, at equal variance with unprejudiced perception and with real concrete thought, regards extensive magnitude as the sole form of quantity, and, where intensive magnitudes occur, does not recognize them in their own character, but makes a violent attempt by a wholly untenable hypothesis to reduce them to extensive magnitudes. Among the charges made against modern philosophy, one is heard more than another. Modern philosophy, it is said, reduces everything to identity. Hence its nickname, the philosophy of identity. But the present discussion may teach that it is philosophy, and philosophy alone, which insists on distinguishing what is logically as well as in experience different, while the professed devotees of experience are the people who erect abstract identity into the chief principle of knoll edge. It is their philosophy which might more appropriately be termed one of identity. Besides, it is quite correct that there are no merely extensive and merely intensive magnitudes, just as little as there are merely continuous and merely discrete magnitudes. The two characteristics of quantity are not opposed as independent kinds. Every intensive magnitude is also extensive, and vice versa. Thus, a certain degree of temperature is an intensive magnitude, which has a perfectly simple sensation corresponding to it as such. If we look at a thermometer, we find this degree of temperature has a certain expansion of the column of mercury corresponding to it, which extensive magnitude changes simultaneously with the temperature or intensive magnitude. The case is similar in the world of mind. A more intensive character has a wider range with its effects than a less intensive. Section 104 in degree the notion of quantum is explicitly put. It is magnitude as indifferent on its own account and simple, but in such a way that the character, or modal being, which makes it a quantum lies quite outside it in other magnitudes. In this contradiction, where the independent indifferent limit is absolute externality, the infinite quantitative progression is made explicit, an immediacy which immediately veers round into its 256. Hegel's logic. Counterpart, intermediation, the passing beyond and over the quantum just laid down, and vice versa. Number is a thought, but thought in its complete self-externalization. Because it is a thought, it does not belong to perception, but it is a thought which is characterized by the externality of perception. Not only therefore may the quantum be increased or diminished without end. The very notion of quantum is thus to push out and out beyond itself. The infinite quantitative progression is only the meaningless repetition of one and the same contradiction, which attaches to the quantum, both generally and, when explicitly invested with its special character, as degree. Touching the futility of enunciating this contradiction in the form of infinite progression, Zeno, as quoted by Aristotle, rightly says, "It is the same to say a thing once, and to say it forever." 1. If we follow the usual definition of the mathematicians, given in section 99, and say that magnitude is what can be increased or diminished, there may be nothing to urge against the correctness of the perception on which it is founded, but the question remains, how we come to assume such a capacity of increase or diminution. If we simply appeal for an answer to experience, we try an unsatisfactory course, because apart from the fact that we should merely have a material image of magnitude, and not the thought of it, magnitude would come out as a bare possibility, of increasing or diminishing, and we should have no key to the necessity for its exhibiting this behavior. In the way of our logical evolution, on the contrary, quantity is obviously a grade in the process of self-determining thought, and it has been shown that it lies in the very notion of quantity to shoot out beyond itself. In that way, the increase or diminution, of which we have heard, is not merely possible, but necessary. 2. The quantitative infinite progression is what the reflective understanding usually relies upon when it is engaged with the general question of infinity. The same thing, however, holds good of this progression, as was already remarked on the occasion of the qualitatively infinite progression. As was then said, it is not the expression of a true, but of a wrong infinity. It never gets further than a bare ought, and thus really remains within the limits of finitude. The quantitative form of this infinite progression, which Spinoza rightly calls a mere imaginary infinity, infinitum imaginationis, is an image often employed by poets, such as Haller and Klopstock, to depict the infinity, not of nature merely, but even of God himself. Thus we find Haller, in a famous description of God's infinity, saying, being 257. I heap up monstrous numbers, mountains of millions. I pile time upon time, and world on the top of world. And when from the awful height I cast a dizzy look towards thee, all the power of number, multiplied 1,000 times, is not yet one part of thee. Here then we meet, in the first place, that continual extrusion of quantity, and especially of number, beyond itself, which Kant describes as eerie. The only really eerie thing about it is the where isomeness of ever fixing, and anon unfixing a limit, without advancing a single step. The same poet however well adds to that description of false infinity the closing line, these I remove, and thou liest all before me. Which means that the true infinite is more than a mere world beyond the finite, and that we, in order to become conscious of it, must renounce that progressus in infinitum. 3. Pythagoras, as is well known, philosophized in numbers, and conceived number as the fundamental principle of things. To the ordinary mind this view must at first glance seem an utter paradox, perhaps a mere craze. What, then, are we to think of it? To answer this question, we must, in the first place, remember that the problem of philosophy consists in tracing back things to thoughts, and, of course, to definite thoughts. Now number is undoubtedly a thought. It is the thought nearest the sensible, or, more precisely expressed, it is the thought of the sensible itself, if we take the sensible to mean what is many, and in reciprocal exclusion. The attempt to apprehend the universe as number is therefore the first step to metaphysics. In the history of philosophy, Pythagoras, as we know, stands between the Ionian philosophers in the Eleatics. While the former, as Aristotle says, never get beyond viewing the essence of things as material, and the latter, especially Parmenides, advanced as far as pure thought, in the shape of being, the principle of the Pythagorean philosophy forms, as it were, the bridge from the sensible to the supersensible. We may gather from this, what is to be said of those who suppose that Pythagoras undoubtedly went too far, when he conceived the essence of things as mere number. It is true, they admit, that we can number things, but, they contend, things are far more than mere numbers. But in what respect are they more? The ordinary sensuous consciousness, from its own point of view, would not hesitate to answer the question by handing us over to sensuous perception, and remarking that things are not merely numerable, but also visible, odorous, palpable, etc. In the phrase of modern times, the fault of Pythagoras would be de. 258. Hegel's logic, ascribed as an excess of idealism. As may be gathered from what has been said on the historical position of the Pythagorean school, the real state of the case is quite the reverse. Let it be conceded that things are more than numbers, but the meaning of that admission must be that the bare thought of number is still insufficient to enunciate the definite notion or essence of things. Instead, then, of saying that Pythagoras went too far with his philosophy of number, it would be nearer the truth to say that he did not go far enough, and in fact the Eleatics were the first to take the further step to pure thought. Besides, even if there are not things, there are states of things, and phenomena of nature altogether, the character of which mainly rests on definite numbers and proportions. This is especially the case with the difference of tones in their harmonic concord, which, according to a well-known tradition, first suggested to Pythagoras to conceive the essence of things as number. Though it is unquestionably important to science to trace back these phenomena to the definite numbers on which they are based, it is wholly inadmissible to view the characterization by thought as a whole as merely numerical. We may certainly feel ourselves prompted to associate the most general characteristics of thought with the first numbers, saying, 1 is the simple and immediate, 2 is difference and mediation, and 3 the unity of both of these. Such associations, however, are purely external. There is nothing in the mere numbers to make them express these definite thoughts. With every step in this method, the more arbitrary grows the association of definite numbers with definite thoughts. Thus, we may view 4 as the unity of 1 and 3, and of the thoughts associated with them, but 4 is just as much the double of 2. Similarly, 9 is not merely the square of 3, but also the sum of 8 and 1, of 7 and 2, and so on. To attach, as do some secret societies of modern times, importance to all sorts of numbers and figures, is to some extent an innocent amusement, but it is also a sign of deficiency of intellectual resource. These numbers, it is said, conceal a profound meaning, and suggest a deal to think about. But the point in philosophy is, not what you may think, but what you do think, and the genuine air of thought is to be sought in thought itself, and not in arbitrarily selected symbols. Section 105 that the quantum in its independent character is external to itself, is what constitutes its quality. In that externality it is itself and referred connectively to itself. There is a union in it of externality, i.e. the quantitative, and of independency, being for self, the qualitative. The quantum, being. 259. When explicitly put thus in its own self is the quantitative ratio, a mode of being which, while, in its exponent, it is an immediate quantum, as also mediation, viz. The reference of some one quantum to another, forming the two sides of the ratio. But the two quanta are not reckoned at their immediate value, their value is only in this relation. The quantitative infinite progression appears at first as a continual extrusion of number beyond itself. On looking closer, it is, however, apparent that in this progression quantity returns to itself. For the meaning of this progression, so far as thought goes, is the fact that number is determined by number. And this gives the quantitative ratio. Take, for example, the ratio 2 to 4. Here we have two magnitudes, not counted in their several immediate values, in which we are only concerned with their mutual relations. This relation of the two terms, the exponent of the ratio, is itself a magnitude, distinguished from the related magnitudes by this, that change in it is followed by change of the ratio, whereas the ratio is unaffected by the change of both its sides, and remains the same so long as the exponent is not changed. Consequently, in place of 2 to 4, we can put 3 to 6 without changing the ratio, as the exponent 2 remains the same in both cases. Section 106 the two sides of the ratio are still immediate quanta, and the qualitative and quantitative characteristics still external to one another. But in their truth, seeing that the quantitative itself in its externality is relation to self, or seeing that the independence and the indifference of the character are combined, it is measure. Thus quantity by means of the dialectical movement so far studied through its several stages, turns out to be a return to quality. The first notion of quantity presented to us was that of quality abrogated and absorbed. That is to say, quantity seemed an external character not identical with being, to which it is quite immaterial. This notion, as we have seen, underlies the mathematical definition of magnitude as what can be increased or diminished. At first sight, this definition may create the impression that quantity is merely whatever can be altered, increase and diminution alike implying determination of magnitude otherwise, and may tend to confuse it with determinate being, the second stage of quality, which in its notion is similarly conceived as alterable. We can, however, complete the definition by adding that in quantity we have an alterable, which in spite of alterations still remains the same. The notion of quantity, it thus turns out, implies an inherent contradiction. 260. Hegel's logic. This contradiction is what forms the dialectic of quantity. The result of the dialectic, however, is not a mere return to quality, as if that were the true and quantity the false notion, but an advance to the unity and truth of both, to qualitative quantity or measure. It may be well, therefore, at this point to observe that whenever in our study of the objective world we are engaged in quantitative determinations, it is in all cases measure which we have in view, as the goal of our operations. This is hinted at even in language, when the ascertainment of quantitative features and relations is called measuring. We measure, e.g. the length of different chords that have been put into a state of vibration, with an eye to the qualitative difference of the tones caused by their vibration, corresponding to this difference of length. Similarly, in chemistry, we try to ascertain the quantity of the matters brought into combination, in order to find out the measures or proportions conditioning such combinations, that is to say, those quantities which give rise to definite qualities. In statistics, too, the numbers with which the study is engaged are important only from the qualitative results conditioned by them. Mere collection of numerical facts, prosecuted without regard to the ends here noted, is justly called an exercise of idle curiosity, of neither theoretical nor practical interest. See measure section 107. Measure is the qualitative quantum, in the first place is immediate, a quantum, to which a determinate being or quality is attached. Measure, where quality and quantity are in one, is thus the completion of being. Being, as we first apprehend it, is something utterly abstract and characterless, but it is the very essence of being to characterize itself, and its complete characterization is reached in measure. Measure, like the other stages of being, may serve as a definition of the absolute. God, it has been said, is the measure of all things. It is this idea which forms the ground note of many of the ancient Hebrew hymns, in which the glorification of God tends in the main to show that he has appointed to everything its bound, to the sea and the solid land, to the rivers and mountains, and also to the various kinds of plants and animals. To the religious sense of the Greeks, the divinity of measure, especially in respect of social ethics, was represented by nemesis. That conception implies a general theory that all human beings, riches, honor, and power, as well as joy and pain, have their definite mayas. Being. 261. The transgression of which brings ruin and destruction. In the world of objects too, we have measure. We see, in the first place, existences in nature, of which measure forms the essential structure. This is the case, for example, with the solar system, which may be described as the realm of free measures. As we next proceed to the study of inorganic nature, measure retires, as it were, into the background. At least we often find the quantitative and qualitative characteristics showing indifference to each other. Thus, the quality of a rock or a river is not tied to a definite magnitude. But even these objects, when closely inspected, are found to be not quite measureless. The water of a river, and the single constituents of a rock, when chemically analyzed, are seen to be qualities conditioned by the quantitative ratios between the matters they contain. In organic nature, however, measure again rises into immediate perception. The various kinds of plants and animals, in the whole as well as in their parts, have a certain measure, though it is worth noticing that the more imperfect forms, those which are least removed from inorganic nature, are partly distinguished from the higher forms by the greater indefiniteness of their measure. Thus among fossils we find some ammonites discernible only by the microscope and others as large as a cartwheel. The same vagueness of measure appears in several plants, which stand on a low level of organic development, for instance ferns. Section 108. In so far as in measure quality and quantity are only in immediate unity, to that extent their difference presents itself in a manner equally immediate. Two cases are then possible. Either the specific quantum or measure is a bare quantum, and the definite being, there and then, is capable of an increase or a diminution, without measure, which to that extent is a rule, being thereby set completely aside. Or the alteration of the quantum is also an alteration of the quality. The identity between quantity and quality, which is found in measure, is at first only implicit and not yet explicitly realized. In other words, these two categories, which unite in measure, each claim an independent authority. On the one hand, the quantitative features of existence may be altered, without affecting its quality. On the other hand, this increase and diminution, immaterial though it be, has its limit, by exceeding which the quality suffers change. Thus the temperature of water is, in the first place, a point of no consequence in respect of its liquidity, still with the increase of diminution of the temperature of the. 262. Hegel's logic. Liquid water, there comes a point where this state of cohesion suffers a qualitative change, and the water is converted into steam or ice. A quantitative change takes place, apparently without any further significance, but there is something lurking behind, and a seemingly innocent change of quantity acts as a kind of snare, to catch hold of the quality. The antinomy of measure which this implies was exemplified under more than one garb among the Greeks. It was asked, for example, whether a single grain makes a heap of wheat, or whether it makes a bald tail to tear out a single hair from the horse's tail. At first, no doubt, looking at the nature of quantity as an indifferent and external character of being, we are disposed to answer these questions in the negative. And yet, as we must admit, this indifferent increase and diminution has its limit. A point is finally reached, where a single additional grain makes a heap of wheat, and the bald tail is produced, if we continue plucking out single hairs. These examples find a parallel in the story of the peasant who, as his ass trudged cheerfully along, went on adding ounce after ounce to its load, till at length it sunk under the unendurable burden. It would be a mistake to treat these examples as pedantic futility. They really turn on thoughts, an acquaintance with which is of great importance in practical life, especially in ethics. Thus in the matter of expenditure, there is a certain latitude within which a more or less does not matter. But when the measure, imposed by the individual circumstances of the special case, is exceeded on the one side or the other, the qualitative nature of measure, as in the above examples of the different temperature of water, makes itself felt, and a course, which a moment before was held good economy, turns into avarice or prodigality. The same principles may be applied in politics, when the constitution of a state has to be looked at as independent of, no less than as dependent on, the extent of its territory, the number of its inhabitants, and other quantitative points of the same kind. If we look, e.g. at a state with a territory of 10,000 square miles and a population of 4 millions, we should, without hesitation, admit that a few square miles of land or a few thousand inhabitants more or less could exercise no essential influence on the character of its constitution. But on the other hand, we must not forget that by the continual increase or diminishing of a state, we finally get to a point where, apart from all other circumstances, this quantitative alteration alone necessarily draws with it an alteration in the quality of the constitution. The constitution of a little Swiss canton does not suit a great kingdom, and, similarly, the constitution of the Roman Republic was unsuitable when transferred to the small imperial towns of Germany. Being 263. Section 109. In this case, when a measure through its quantitative nature has gone in excess of its qualitative character, we meet what is at first an absence of measure, the measureless. But seeing that the second quantitative ratio, which in comparison with the first is measureless, is none the less qualitative, the measureless is also a measure. These two transitions, from quality to quantum, and from the latter back again to quality, may be represented under the image of an infinite progression, as the self-abrogation and restoration of measure in the measureless. Quantity, as we have seen, is not only capable of alteration, i.e. of increase or diminution, it is naturally and necessarily a tendency to exceed itself. This tendency is maintained even in measure. But if the quantity present in measure exceeds a certain limit, the quality corresponding to it is also put in abeyance. This, however, is not a negation of quality altogether, but only of this definite quality, the place of which is at once occupied by another. This process of measure, which appears alternately as a mere change in quantity, and then as a sudden revulsion of quantity into quality, may be envisaged under the figure of a nodal, knotted, line. Such lines we find in nature under a variety of forms. We have already referred to the qualitatively different states of aggregation water exhibits under increase or diminution of temperature. The same phenomenon is presented by the different degrees in the oxidation of metals. Even the difference of musical notes may be regarded as an example of what takes place in the process of measure, the revulsion from what is at first merely quantitative into qualitative alteration. Section 11.0. What really takes place here is that the immediacy, which still attaches to measure as such, is set aside. In measure, at first, quality and quantity itself are immediate, and measure is only their relative identity. But measure shows itself absorbed and superseded in the measureless. Yet the measureless, although it be the negation of measure, is itself a unity of quantity and quality. Thus in the measureless the measure is still seen to meet only with itself. Section 111. Instead of the more abstract factors, being and nothing, some and other, etc., the infinite, which is affirmation as a negation of negation. 264. Hegel's logic now finds its factors in quality and quantity. These, alpha, have in the first place passed over quality into quantity, section 98, and quantity into quality, section 105, and thus are both shown up as negations, beta. But in their unity, that is, in measure, they are originally distinct, and the one is only through the instrumentality of the other. And, gamma, after the immediacy of this unity has turned out to be self-annulling, the unity is explicitly put as what it implicitly is, simple relation to self, which contains in it being in all its forms absorbed. Being or immediacy, which by the negation of itself is a mediation with self and a reference to self, which consequently is also a mediation which cancels itself into reference to self, or immediacy, is essence. The process of measure, instead of being only the wrong infinite of an endless progression, in the shape of an ever-recurrent recoil from quality to quantity and from quantity to quality, is also a true infinity of coincidence with self in other. In measure, quality and quantity originally confront each other, like sum and other. But quality is implicitly quantity and conversely quantity is implicitly quality. In the process of measure, therefore, these two pass into each other. Each of them becomes what it already was implicitly, and thus we get being thrown into abeyance and absorbed, with its several characteristics negative. Such being is essence. Measure is implicitly essence, and its process consists in realizing what it is implicitly. The ordinary consciousness conceives things as being, and studies them in quality, quantity, and measure. These immediate characteristics, however, soon show themselves to be not fixed but transient, and essence is the result of their dialectic. In the sphere of essence, one category does not pass into another, but refers to another merely. In being, the form of reference is purely due to our reflection on what takes place, but it is the special and proper characteristic of essence. In the sphere of being, when somewhat becomes another, the somewhat has vanished. Not so in essence. Here there is no real other, but only diversity, reference of the one to its other. The transition of essence is therefore at the same time no transition, for in the passage of different into different, the different does not vanish, the different terms remain in their relation. When we speak of being and not, being is independent, so is not. The case is otherwise with the positive and the negative. No doubt these possess the characteristic of being and not. But the positive by itself has no sense, it is wholly in reference to the negative. And it is the same with the negative. Being. 265. In the sphere of being, the reference of one term to another is only implicit, in essence, on the contrary, it is explicit. And this in general is the distinction between the forms of being and essence. In being, everything is immediate, in essence, everything is relative. 8. Second subdivision of logic. The doctrine of essence, section 11:2. The terms in essence are always mere pairs of correlatives, and yet not absolutely reflected in themselves. Hence, in essence, the actual unity of the notion is not yet realized, but only postulated by reflection. Sense, which is being coming into mediation with itself through the negativity of itself, is self-relatedness, only in so far as it is relation to another, this other, however, coming to view at first not as something which is, but as postulated and hypothesized. Being has not vanished. But, firstly, essence, as simple self-relation, is being, and secondly, as regards its one-sided characteristic of immediacy, being is deposed to a mere negative, to a seeming or reflected light. Sense accordingly is being, thus reflecting light into itself. The absolute is the essence. This is the same definition as the previous one, that the absolute is being, in so far as being likewise is simple self-relation. But it is at the same time higher, because essence is being that has gone into itself. That is to say, the simple self-relation, in being, as expressly put as negation of the negative, is immanent self-mediation. Unfortunately, when the absolute is defined to be essence, the negativity which this implies is often taken only to mean the withdrawal of all determinate predicates. This negative action of withdrawal or abstraction thus falls outside of the essence, which is thus left as a mere result apart from its premises, the caput mortuum of abstraction. But as this negativity, instead of being external to being, is its own dialectic, the truth of the lat ter, viz. Essence, will be being as retired within itself, immanent being. That reflection, or light thrown into itself, constitutes the distinction between essence and immediate being, and is the peculiar characteristic of essence itself. Any mention of essence implies that we distinguish it from being. The latter is immediate, and, compared with the essence, we look upon it as mere seeming. But this seeming is not an utter nonentity and no thing at all, but being superseded and put by. The point of view given by the essence is, in general, the standpoint of reflection. This word, reflection, is originally applied when a ray of light in a straight line impinging upon the surface of a mirror is thrown back from it. In this essence. 267. Phenomenon, we have two things, first an immediate fact which is, and secondly the deputed, derivated, or transmitted phase of the same. Something of this sort takes place when we reflect, or think upon an object, for here we want to know the object, not in its immediacy, but as derivative or mediated. The problem or aim of philosophy is often represented as the ascertainment of the essence of things, a phrase which only means that things, instead of being left in their immediacy, must be shown to be mediated by, or based upon, something else. The immediate being of things is thus conceived under the image of a rind or curtain behind which the essence is hidden. Everything, it is said, has an essence, that is, things really are not what they immediately show themselves. There is something more to be done than merely rove from one quality to another, and merely to advance from qualitative to quantitative, and vice versa. There is a permanence in things, and that permanence is in the first instance their essence. With respect to other meanings and uses of the category of essence, we may note that in the German auxiliary verb, sein, to be, the past tense is expressed by the term for essence, Wesen. We designate past being as gewesen. This anomaly of language implies to some extent a correct perception of the relation between being and essence. Sense we may certainly regard as past being, remembering however meanwhile that the past is not utterly denied, but only laid aside and thus at the same time preserved. Thus, to say, Caesar was in Gaul, only denies the immediacy of the event, but not his sojourn in Gaul altogether. That sojourn is just what forms the import of the proposition, in which however it is represented as over and gone. Wesen in ordinary life frequently means only a collection or aggregate, Zeitungswesen, the press, Postwesen, the post of Feis, Steuerwesen, the revenue. All that these terms mean is that the things in question are not to be taken single, in their immediacy, but as a complex, and then, perhaps, in addition, in their various bearings. This usage of the term is not very different in its implications from our own. People also speak of finite essences, such as man. But the very term essence implies that we have made a step beyond finitude, and the TTLE is applied to man is so far inexact. It is often added that there is a supreme essence, being, by which is meant God. On this two remarks may be made. In the first place, the phrase, there is, suggests a finite only. As when we say there are so many planets, or there are plants of such a constitution and plants of such another. In these cases. 268. Hegel's logic. We are speaking of something which has other things beyond and beside it. But God, the absolutely infinite, is not something outside and beside whom there are other essences. All else outside God, if separated from him, possesses no essentiality. In its isolation it becomes a mere show or seeming, without stay or essence of its own. But, secondly, it is a poor way of talking to call God the highest or supreme essence. The category of quantity which the phrase employs has its proper place within the compass of the finite. When we call one mountain the highest on the earth, we have a vision of other high mountains beside it. So too when we call anyone the richest or most learned in his country. But God, far from being a being, even the highest, is the being. This definition, however, though such a representation of God is an important and necessary stage in the growth of the religious consciousness, does not by any means exhaust the depth of the ordinary Christian idea of God. If we consider God as the essence only, and nothing more, we know him only as the universal and irresistible power, in other words, as the Lord. Now the fear of the Lord is, doubtless, the beginning, but only the beginning, of wisdom. To look at God in this light, as the Lord, and the Lord alone, is especially characteristic of Judaism and also of Mohammedanism. The defect of these religions lies in their scant recognition of the finite, which, be it as natural things or as finite phases of mind, it is characteristic of the heathen and, as they also for that reason are, polytheistic religions to maintain intact. Another not uncommon assertion is that God, as the supreme being, cannot be known. Such is the view taken by modern enlightenment and abstract understanding, which is content to say il y a un etre suprema, and there lets the matter rest. To speak thus, and treat God merely as the supreme otherworld being, implies that we look upon the world before us in its immediacy as something permanent and positive, and forget that true being is just the superseding of all that is immediate. If God be the abstract supersensible being, outside whom therefore lies all difference and all specific character, he is only a bare name, a mere caput mortuum of abstracting understanding. The true knowledge of God begins when we know that things, as they immediately are, have no truth. In reference also to other subjects besides God, the category of essence is often liable to an abstract use, by which, in the study of anything, its essence is held to be something unaffected by, and subsisting in independence of, its definite phenomenal embodiment. Thus we say, for example, of people, that the great thing is not what they do or how they behave, but what they are. This is correct, if it means that essence. 269. A man's conduct should be looked at, not in its immediacy, but only as it is explained by his inner self, and as a revelation of that inner self. Still it should be remembered that the only means by which the essence and the inner self can be verified is their appearance in outward reality, whereas the appeal which men make to the essential life, as distinct from the material facts of conduct, is generally prompted by a desire to assert their own subjectivity and to elude an absolute and objective judgment. Section 11.3 IDENTITY Self-relation in essence is the form of identity or of reflection into self, which has here taken the place of the immediacy of being. They are both the same abstraction, self-relation. The unintelligence of sense, to take everything limited and finite for being, passes into the obstinacy of understanding, which views the finite as self-identical, not inherently self-contradictory. THEUNASSENTIAL Section 11.4 This identity, as it descended from being, appears in the first place only charged with the characteristics of being, and referred to being as to something external. This external being, if taken in separation from the true being, of essence, is called the unessential. But that turns out to be a mistake. Because essence is being in self, it is essential only to the extent that it has in itself its negative, i.e. reference to another, or mediation. Consequently, it has the unessential as its own proper seeming, reflection, in itself. But in seeming or mediation there is distinction involved, and since what is distinguished, as distinguished from identity out of which it arises, and in which it is not, or lies as seeming, receives itself the form of identity, the semblance is still not in the mode of being, or of self-related immediacy. The sphere of essence thus turns out to be a still imperfect combination of immediacy and mediation. In it every term is expressly invested with the character of self-relatedness, while yet at the same time one is forced beyond it. It has being, reflected being, a being in which another shows, and which shows in another. And so it is also the sphere in which the contradiction, still implicit in the sphere of being, is made explicit. 270. Hegel's logic. As this one notion is the common principle underlying all logic, there appear in the development of essence the same attributes or terms as in the development of being, but in reflex form. Instead of being and not we have now the forms of positive and negative. The former at first is identity corresponding to pure and uncontrasted being, the latter developed, showing in itself, as difference. So also, we have being represented by the ground of determinate being, which shows itself, when reflected upon the ground, as existence. The theory of essence is the most difficult branch of logic. It includes the categories of metaphysics and of the sciences in general. These are the products of reflective understanding, which, while it assumes the differences to possess a footing of their own, and at the same time also expressly affirms their relativity, still combines the two statements, side by side, or one after the other, by an also, without bringing these thoughts into one, are unifying them into the notion. A essence as ground of existence, the pure principle or categories of our reflection. Alpha. Identity section 11.5. The essence lights up in itself or as mere reflection, and therefore is only self-relation, not as immediate but as reflected. And that reflex relation is self-identity. This identity becomes an identity, in form only, or of the understanding, if it be held hard and fast, quite aloof from difference. Or, rather, abstraction is the imposition of this identity of form, the transformation of something inherently concrete into this form of elementary simplicity. And this may be done in two ways. Either we may neglect a part of the multiple features which are found in the concrete thing, by what is called analysis, and select only one of them, or, neglecting their variety, we may concentrate the multiple character into one. If we associate identity with the absolute, making the absolute the subject of a proposition, we get the absolute is what is identical with itself. However true this proposition may be, it is doubtful whether it be. Essence. 271. Meant in its truth, and therefore it is at least imperfect in the expression. For it is left undecided, whether it means the abstract identity of understanding abstract. That is, because contrasted with the other characteristics of essence, or the identity which is inherently concrete. In the latter case, as will be seen, true identity is first discoverable in the ground, and, with a higher truth, in the notion. Even the word absolute is often used to mean more than abstract. Absolute space and absolute time, for example, is another way of saying abstract space and abstract time. When the principles of essence are taken as essential principles of thought, they become predicates of a presupposed subject, which, because they are essential, is everything. The propositions thus arising have been stated as universal laws of thought. Thus the first of them, the maxim of identity, reads, everything is identical with itself, A equals A, and negatively, A cannot at the same time be A and not A. This maxim, instead of being a true law of thought, is nothing but the law of abstract understanding. The propositional form itself contradicts it, for a proposition always promises a distinction between subject and predicate, while the present one does not fulfill what its form requires. But the law is particularly set aside by the following so-called laws of thought, which make laws out of its opposite. It is asserted that the maxim of identity, though it cannot be proved, regulates the procedure of every consciousness, and that experience shows it to be accepted as soon as its terms are apprehended. To this alleged experience of the logic books may be opposed the universal experience that no mind thinks or forms conceptions or speaks in accordance with this law, and that no existence of any kind whatever conforms to it. Utterances after the fashion of this pretended law, a planet is a planet, magnetism is magnetism, mind is mind, are, as they deserve to be, reputed silly. That is certainly a matter of general experience. The logic which seriously propounds such laws in the scholastic world in which alone they are valid have long been discredited with practical common sense as well as with the philosophy of reason. Identity is, in the first place, the repetition of what we had earlier as being, but has become, through supersession of its character of immediateness. It is therefore being as ideality. It is important to come to a proper understanding on the true meaning of identity, and, for that purpose, we must especially guard against taking it as abstract identity. 272. Hegel's logic. To the exclusion of all difference. That is the touchstone for distinguishing all bad philosophy from what alone deserves the name of philosophy. Identity in its truth, as an ideality of what immediately is a high category for our religious modes of mind as well as all other forms of thought and mental activity. The true knowledge of God, it may be said, begins when we know Him as identity, as absolute identity. To know so much as to see all the power and glory of the world sinks into nothing in God's presence, and subsists only as the reflection of His power and His glory. In the same way, identity, as self-consciousness, is what distinguishes man from nature, particularly from the brutes which never reach the point of comprehending themselves as I, that is, pure self-contained unity. So again, in connection with thought, the main thing is not to confuse the true identity, which contains being and its characteristics ideally transfigured in it, with an abstract identity of bare form. All the charges of narrowness, hardness, meaninglessness, which are so often directed against thought from the quarter of feeling and immediate perception rest on the perverse assumption that thought acts only as a faculty of abstract identification. The formal logic itself confirms this assumption by laying down the supreme law of thought, so-called, which has been discussed above. If thinking were no more than an abstract identity, we could not but own it to be a most futile and tedious business. No doubt the notion, and the idea too, are identical with themselves, but identical only in so far as they at the same time involve distinction. Opening parenthesis. Beta. Difference section 11.6. Essence is mere identity and reflection in itself only as it is self-relating negativity, and in that way self-repulsion. It contains therefore essentially the characteristic of difference. Other being is here no longer qualitative, taking the shape of the character or limit. It is now in essence, in self-relating essence, and therefore the negation is at the same time a relation, is, in short, distinction, relativity, mediation. To ask, How identity comes to difference assumes that identity as mere abstract identity is something of itself, and difference also something else equally independent. This supposition renders an answer to the question impossible. If identity is viewed as diverse from essence. 273. Difference. All that we have in this way is but difference, and hence we cannot demonstrate the advance to difference, because the person who asks for the how of the progress thereby implies that for him the starting point is non-existent. The question then when put to the test has obviously no meaning, and its proposer may be met with the question what he means by identity, whereupon we should soon see that he attaches no idea to it at all, and that identity is for him an empty name. As we have seen, besides, identity is undoubtedly a negative, not however an abstract empty not, but the negation of being and its characteristics. Being so, identity is at the same time self-relation, and, what is more, negative self-relation. In other words, it draws a distinction between it and itself. Div section 11.7 difference is first of all, 1. Immediate difference, i.e. diversity or variety. In diversity the different things are each individually what they are, and unaffected by the relation in which they stand to each other. This relation is therefore external to them. In consequence of the various things being thus indifferent to the difference between them, it falls outside them into a third thing, the agent of comparison. This external difference, as an identity of the objects related, is likeness, as a non-identity of them, is unlikeness. The gap which understanding allows to divide these characteristics is so great that although comparison has one and the same substratum for likeness and unlikeness, which are explained to be different aspects and points of view in it, still likeness by itself is the first of the elements alone, viz. Identity, and unlikeness by itself is difference. Diversity has, like identity, been transformed into a maxim. Everything is various or different, or, there are no two things completely like each other. Here everything is put under a predicate, which is the reverse of the identity attributed to it in the first maxim, and therefore under a law contradicting the first. However, there is an explanation. As the diversity is supposed due only to external circumstances, anything taken per se is expected and understood always to be identical with itself, so that the second law need not interfere with the first. But, in that case, variety does not belong to the something or everything in question. It constitutes no intrinsic characteristic of the subject, and the second maxim on this showing does not admit of being stated at all. If, on the 274. Hegel's logic. Other hand, the something itself is, as the maxim says, diverse, it must be in virtue of its own proper character. But in this case the specific difference, and not variety as such, is what is intended. And this is the meaning of the maxim of Leibniz. When understanding sets itself to study identity, it has already passed beyond it, and is looking at difference in the shape of bare variety. If we follow the so-called law of identity, and say, the sea is the sea, the air is the air, the moon is the moon, these objects pass for having no bearing on one another. What we have before us therefore is not identity, but difference. We do not stop at this point, however, or regard things merely as different. We compare them one with another, and then discover the features of likeness and unlikeness. The work of the finite sciences lies to a great extent in the application of these categories, and the phrase scientific treatment generally means no more than the method which has for its aim comparison of the objects under examination. This method has undoubtedly led to some important results. We may particularly mention the great advance of modern times in the provinces of comparative anatomy and comparative linguistics. But it is going too far to suppose that the comparative method can be employed with equal success in all branches of knowledge. Nor, and this must be emphasized, can mere comparison ever ultimately satisfy the requirements of science. Its results are indeed indispensable, but they are still labors only preliminary to truly intelligent cognition. If it be the office of comparison to reduce existing differences to identity, the science which most perfectly fulfills that end is mathematics. The reason of that is that quantitative difference is only the difference which is quite external. Thus, in geometry, a triangle and a quadrangle, figures qualitatively different, have this qualitative difference discounted by abstraction, and are equalized to one another in magnitude. It follows from what has been said formerly about mere identity of understanding that, as has also been pointed out, s. 99, neither philosophy nor the empirical sciences need envy the superior ity of mathematics. The story is told that when Leibniz propounded the maxim of variety, the cavaliers and ladies of the court, as they walked round the garden, made efforts to discover two leaves indistinguishable from each other, in order to confute the law stated by the philosopher. Their device was unquestionably a convenient method of dealing with metaphysics, one which has not ceased to be fashionable. All the essence. 275. Same, as regards the principle of Leibniz, difference must be understood to mean not an external and indifferent diversity merely, but difference essential. Hence the very nature of things implies that they must be different. Likensandunlikness section 11.8 Likeness is an identity only of those things which are not the same, not identical with each other, and unlikeness is a relation of things alike. The two therefore do not fall on different aspects or points of view in the thing, without any mutual affinity, but one throws light into the other. Variety thus comes to be reflexive difference or difference, distinction, implicit and essential, determinate or specific difference. differentiatyn not alscence while things merely various show themselves unaffected by each other. Likeness and unlikeness on the contrary are a pair of characteristics which are in completely reciprocal relation. This advance from simple variety to opposition appears in our common acts of thought when we allow that comparison has a meaning only upon the hypothesis of an existing difference, and that on the other hand we can distinguish only on the hypothesis of existing similarity. Hence, if the problem be the discovery of a difference, we attribute no great cleverness to the man who only distinguishes those objects, of which the difference is palpable, e.g. a pen and a camel, and similarly it implies no very advanced faculty of comparison when the objects compared, e.g. a beech and an oak, a temple and a church, are near akin. In the case of difference, in short, we like to see identity, and in the case of identity, we like to see difference. Within the range of empirical sciences, however, the one of these two categories is often allowed to put the other out of sight and mind. Thus, the scientific problem at one time is to reduce existing differences to identity, on another occasion, with equal one-sidedness, to discover new differences. We see this especially in physical science. There the problem consists, in the first place, in the continual search for new elements, new forces, new genera and species. Or, in another direction, it seeks to show that all bodies hitherto thought to be simple or compound, and modern physicists and chemists smile at the inscients, who are satisfied with 4 elements, and these not simple. Secondly, and on the other hand, mere identity is made the chief case. 276. Hegel's logic. Tion. Thus electricity and chemical affinity are regarded as the same, and even the organic processes of digestion and assimilation are looked upon as a mere chemical operation. Modern philosophy has of 10 been nicknamed the philosophy of identity. But, as was already remarked, s. 103, note, it is precisely philosophy, and in particular speculative logic, which lays bare the nothingness of the abstract, undifferentiated identity, known to understanding, though it also undoubtedly urges its disciples not to rest at mere diversity, but to ascertain the inner of all existence. Section 11.9 Difference implicit is essential difference, the positive and the negative, and that is this way. The positive is the identical self-relation in such a way as not to be the negative, and the negative is the different by itself so as not to be the positive. Thus either has an existence of its own in proportion as it is not the other. The one is made visible in the other, and is only in so far as that other is. Essential difference is therefore opposition, according to which the different is not confronted by any other but by its other. That is, either of these two, positive and negative, is stamped with a characteristic of its own only in its relation to the other. The one is only reflected into itself as it is reflected into the other. And so with the other. Either in this way is the other's own other. Difference implicit or essential gives the maxim, everything is essentially distinct, or, as it has also been expressed, of two opposite predicates the one only can be assigned to anything, and there is no third possible. This maxim of contrast or opposition most expressly controverts the maxim of identity. The one says a thing should be only self-relation, the other says it must be an opposite, a relation to its other. The native unintelligence of abstraction betrays itself by setting in juxtaposition two contrary maxims, like these, as laws, without even so much as comparing them. The maxim of excluded middle is the maxim of the definite understanding, which would fain avoid contradiction, but in so doing falls into it. A must be either plus A or A, it says. It virtually declares in these words a third A which is neither plus nor, and which at the same time is yet invested with plus and characters. If plus W means 6 miles to the west, and W means 6 miles to the east, and if the plus and cancel each other, the 6 miles of way or space remain what they were with and without the contrast. Even the mere plus and mi. Essence. 277. News of number or abstract direction have, if we like, 0, for their third. But it need not be denied that the empty contrast, which understanding institutes between plus and minus, is not without its value in such abstract tions as number, direction, and c. In the doctrine of contradictory concepts, the one notion is, say, blue, for in this doctrine even the sensuous generalized image of a color is called a notion, and the other not blue. This other then would not be an affirmative, say, yellow, but would merely be kept at the abstract negative. That the negative in its own nature is quite as much positive, see next section, is implied in saying that what is opposite to another is its other. The in and ity of the opposition between what are called contradictory notions is fully exhibited in what we may call the grandiose formula of a general law, that everything has the one and not the other of all predicates which are in such opposition. In this way, mind is either white or not white, yellow or not yellow, etc., ad infinitum. It was forgotten that identity and opposition are themselves opposed, and the maxim of opposition was taken even for that of identity, in the shape of the principle of contradiction. A notion, which possesses neither or both of two mutually contradictory marks, e.g. a quadrangular circle, is held to be logically false. Now though a multiangular circle and a rectilinear arc no less contradict this maxim, geometers never hesitate to treat the circle as a polygon with rectilineal sides. But anything like a circle, that is to say its mere character or nominal definition, is still no notion. In the notion of a circle, center and circumference are equally essential. Both marks belong to it, and yet center and circumference are opposite and contradictory to each other. The conception of polarity, which is so dominant in physics, contains by implication the more correct definition of opposition. But physics for its theory of the laws of thought adheres to the ordinary logic. It might therefore well be horrified in case it should ever work out the conception of polarity, and get at the thoughts which are implied in it. 1. With the positive we return to identity, but in its higher truth as identical self-relation, and at the same time with the note that it is not the negative. The negative per se is the same as difference itself. The identical as such is primarily the yet uncharacterized. The positive on the other hand is what is self-identical, but with the mark of antithesis to another. And the negative as difference as such, characterized as not identity. This is the difference of difference within its own self. 278. Hegel's logic. Positive and negative are supposed to express an absolute difference. The two, however, are at bottom the same. The name of either might be transferred to the other. Thus, for example, debts and assets are not two particular, self-subsisting species of property. What is negative to the debtor is positive to the creditor. A way to the east is also a way to the west. Positive and negative are therefore intrinsically conditioned by one another, and are only in relation to each other. The north pole of the magnet cannot be without the south pole, and vice versa. If we cut a magnet in two, we have not a north pole in one piece, and a south pole in the other. Similar, in electricity, the positive and the negative are not two diverse and independent fluids. In opposition, the different is not confronted by an other, but by its other. Usually we regard different things as unaffected by each other. Thus we say, I am a human being, and around me are air, water, animals, and all sorts of things. Everything is thus put outside of every other. But the aim of philosophy is to banish indifference, and to ascertain the necessity of things. By that means the other is seen to stand over against its other. Thus, for example, inorganic nature is not to be considered merely something else than organic nature, but the necessary antithesis of it. Both are in essential relation to one another, and the one of the two is, only in so far as it excludes the other from it, and thus relates itself thereto. Nature in like manner is not without mind, nor mind without nature. An important step has been taken, when we cease in thinking to use phrases like, of course something else is also possible. While we speak, we are still tainted with contingency, and all true thinking, we have already said, is a thinking of necessity. In modern physical science the opposition, first observed to exist in magnetism as polarity, has come to be regarded as a universal law pervading the whole of nature. This would be a real scientific advance, if care were at the same time taken not to let mere variety revert without explanation, as a valid category, side by side with opposition. Thus at one time the colors are regarded as in polar opposition to one another, and called complementary colors. At another time they are looked at in their indifferent and merely quantitative difference of red, yellow, green, etc. 2. Instead of speaking by the maxim of excluded middle, which is the maxim of abstract understanding, we should rather say, everything is opposite. Neither in heaven nor in earth, neither in the world of mind nor of nature, is there anywhere such an abstract, either or, as the understanding maintains. Whatever exists is concrete, with difference and opposition in itself. The finitude of things will then lie in the essence. 279. Want of correspondence between their immediate being, and what they essentially are. Thus, in inorganic nature, the acid is implicitly at the same time the base, in other words, its only being consists in its relation to its other. Hence also the acid is not something that persists quietly in the contrast, it is always an effort to realize what it potentially is. Contradiction is the very moving principle of the world, and it is ridiculous to say that contradiction is unthinkable. The only thing correct in that statement is that contradiction is not the end of the matter, but cancels itself. But contradiction, when cancelled, does not leave abstract identity, for that is itself only one side of the contrariety. The proximate result of opposition, when realized as contradiction, is the ground, which contains identity as well as difference superseded and deposited two elements in the completer notion. Section 120. Contrariety then has two forms. The positive is the aforesaid various, different, which is understood to be independent, and yet at the same time not to be unaffected by its relation to its other. The negative is to be, no less independently, negative self-relating, self-subsistent, and yet at the same time as negative must on every point have this its self-relation, i.e. its positive, only in the other. Both positive and negative are therefore explicit contradiction, both are potentially the same. Both are so actually also, since either is the abrogation of the other and of itself. Thus they fall to the ground. Or as is plain, the essential difference, as only the difference of it from itself, and thus contains the identical, so that to essential and actual difference there belongs itself as well as identity. As self-relating difference it is likewise virtually enunciated as the self-identical. And the opposite is in general that which includes the one and its other, itself and its opposite. The immanence of essence thus defined as the ground. Opening parenthesis. Gamma gamma. The G-round section 121. The ground is the unity of identity and difference, the truth of what difference and identity have turned out to be, the reflection into self, which is equally a reflection into other, and vice versa. It is essence put explicitly as a totality. 280. Hegel's logic. The maxim of ground runs thus. Everything has its sufficient ground. That is, the true essentiality of anything is not the predication of it as identical with itself, or as different, various, or merely positive, or merely negative, but as having its being in another, which, being the self-same, is its essence. And to this extent the essence is not abstract reflection into self, but into another. The ground is the essence in its own inwardness. The essence is intrinsically a ground, and it is a ground only when it is a ground of somewhat, of another. We must be careful, when we say that the ground is the unity of identity and difference, not to understand by this unity an abstract identity. Otherwise we only change the name, while we still think the identity, of understanding, already seen to be false. To avoid this misconception we may say that the ground, besides being the unity, is also the difference of identity and difference. In that case in the ground, which promised at first to supersede contradiction, a new contradiction seems to arise. It is however, a contradiction, which, so far from persisting quietly in itself, is rather the expulsion of it from itself. The ground is a ground only to the extent that it affords ground, but the result which thus issued from the ground is only itself. In this lies its formalism. The ground and what is grounded are one and the same content. The difference between the two is the mere difference of form which separates simple self-relation, on the one hand, from mediation, or derivativeness on the other. Inquiry into the grounds of things goes with the point of view which, as already noted, section 112n, is adopted by reflection. We wish, as it were, to see the matter double, first in its immediacy, and secondly in its ground, where it is no longer immediate. This is the plain meaning of the law of sufficient ground, is that things should essentially be viewed as mediated. The manner in which formal logic establishes this law sets a bad example to other sciences. Formal logic asks these sciences not to accept their subject matter as it is immediately given, and yet herself lays down a law of thought without deducing it, in other words, without exhibiting its mediation. With the same justice as the logician maintains our faculty of thought to be so constituted that we must ask for the ground of everything, might the physicist, when asked why a man who falls into water is drowned, reply that man happens to be so constituted that he cannot live under water, or the jurist, when asked why a criminal is punished, reply that civil society happens to be so constituted that crimes cannot be left unpunished. Essence. 281. Yet even if logic be excused the duty of giving a ground for the law of sufficient ground, it might at least explain what is to be understood by a ground. The common explanation, which describes the ground as what has a consequence, seems at first glance more lucid and intelligible than the preceding definition in logical terms. If you ask however what the consequence is, you are told that it is what has a ground, and it becomes obvious that the explanation is intelligible only because it assumes what in our case has been reached as the termination of an antecedent movement of thought. And this is the true business of logic, to show that those thoughts, which is usually employed merely float before consciousness neither understood nor demonstrated, are really grades in the self-determination of thought. It is by no means that they are understood and demonstrated. In common life, and it is the same in the finite sciences, this reflective form is often employed as a key to the secret of the real condition of the objects of investigation. So long as we deal with what may be termed the household needs of knowledge, nothing can be urged against this method of study. But it can never afford definitive satisfaction, either in theory or practice. And the reason why it fails is that the ground is yet without a definite content of its own, so that to regard anything as resting upon a ground merely gives the formal difference of mediation in place of immediacy. We see an electrical phenomenon, for example, and we ask for its ground, or reason. We are told that electricity is the ground of this phenomenon. What is this but the same content as we had immediately before us, only translated into the form of inwardness? The ground, however, is not merely simple self-identity, but also different. Hence various grounds may be alleged for the same sum of fact. This variety of grounds, again, following the logic of difference, culminates in opposition of grounds pro and contra. In any action, such as a theft, there is a sum of fact in which several aspects may be distinguished. The theft has violated the rights of property. It has given the means of satisfying his wants to the needy thief. Possibly too the man, from whom the theft was made, misused his property. The violation of property is unquestionably the decisive point of view before which the others must give way. But the bare law of the ground cannot settle that question. Usually indeed the law is interpreted to speak of a sufficient ground, not of any ground whatever, and it might be supposed therefore, in the action referred to, that, although other points of view besides the violation of property might be held as grounds, yet they would not be sufficient grounds. But here comes a dilemma. If we use the phrase, sufficient ground, the epithet is either ocios or of such a. 282. Hegel's logic, kind as to carry us past the mere category of ground. The predicate is ocios and tautological, if it only states the capability of giving a ground or reason, for the ground is a ground, only in so far as it has this capability. If a soldier runs away from battle to save his life, his conduct is certainly a violation of duty, but it cannot be held that the ground which led him so to act was insufficient, otherwise he would have remained at his post. Besides, there is this also to be said. On one hand any ground suffices, on the other no ground suffices is mere ground, because, as already said, it is yet void of a content objectively and intrinsically determined, and is therefore not self-acting and productive. A content thus objectively and intrinsically determined, and hence self-acting, will hereafter come before us as the notion, and it is the notion which Leibniz had in his eye when he spoke of sufficient ground, and urged the study of things under its point of view. His remarks were originally directed against that merely mechanical method of conceiving things so much in vogue even now, a method which he justly pronounces insufficient. We may see an instance of this mechanical theory of investigation when the organic process of the circulation of the blood is traced back merely to the contraction of the heart, or when certain theories of criminal law explain the purpose of punishment to lie in deterring people from crime, in rendering the criminal harmless, or in other extraneous grounds of the same kind. It is unfair to Leibniz to suppose that he was content with anything so poor as this formal law of the ground. The method of investigation which he inaugurated is the very reverse of a formalism which acquiesces in mere grounds, where a full and concrete knowledge is sought. Considerations to this effect led Leibniz to contrast causae efficientis and causae finalis, and to insist on the place of final causes as the conception to which the efficient were to lead up. If we adopt this distinction, light, heat, and moisture would be the causae efficientis, not causa finalis of the growth of plants. The cause finalis is the notion of the plant itself. To get no further than mere grounds, especially on questions of law and morality, is the position and principle of the sophists. Sophistry, as we ordinarily conceive it, is a method of investigation which aims at distorting what is just and true, and exhibiting things in a false light. Such, however, is not the proper or primary tendency of sophistry, the standpoint of which is no other than that of raisonnement. The sophists came on the scene at a time when the Greeks had begun to grow dissatisfied with mere authority and tradition and felt the need of intellectual justification for what they were to accept as obligatory. Essence. 283. That desideratum the sophists supplied by teaching their countrymen to seek for the various points of view under which things may be considered, which points of view are the same as grounds. But the ground, as we have seen, has no essential and objective principles of its own, and it is as easy to discover grounds for what is wrong and immoral as for what is moral and right. Upon the observer, therefore, it depends to decide what points are to have most weight. The decision in such circumstances is prompted by his individual views and sentiments. Thus, the objective foundation of what ought to have been of absolute and essential obligation, accepted by all, was undermined, and sophistry by this destructive action deservedly brought upon itself the bad name previously mentioned. Socrates, as we all know, met the sophists at every point, not by a bare reassertion of authority and tradition against their argumentations, but by showing dialectically how untenable the mere grounds were, and by vindicating the obligations of justice and goodness, by reinstating the universal or notion of the will. In the present day, such a method of argumentation is not quite out of fashion. Nor is that the case only in the discussion of secular matters. It occurs even in sermons, such as those where every possible ground of gratitude to God is propounded. To such pleading Socrates and Plato would not have scrupled to apply the name of sophistry. For sophistry has nothing to do with what is taught, that may very possibly be true. Sophistry lies in the formal circumstance of teaching it by grounds which are as available for attack as for defense. In a time so rich in reflection and so devoted to raisonnement as our own, he must be a poor creature who cannot advance a good ground for everything, even for what is worst and most depraved. Everything in the world that has become corrupt has had good ground for its corruption. An appeal to grounds at first makes the hearer think of beating a retreat. But when experience has taught him the real state of these matters, he closes his ears against them, and refuses to be imposed upon any more. Section 122. As it first comes, the chief feature of essence is show in itself and intermediation in itself. But when it has completed the circle of intermediation, its unity with itself is explicitly put as the self-annulling of difference, and therefore of intermediation. Once more then we come back to immediacy or being, but being in so far as it is intermediated by annulling the intermediation. And that being is existence. 284. Hegel's logic. The ground is not yet determined by objective principles of its own, nor is it an end or final cause, hence it is not active, not productive. An excess tense only proceeds from the ground. The determinate ground is therefore a formal matter, that is to say, any point will do, so long as it is expressly put as self-relation, as affirmation, in correlation with the immediate excess tense depending on it. If it be a ground at all, it is a good ground, for the term good is employed abstractly as equivalent to affirmative, and any point, or feature, as good which can in any way be enunciated as confess edly affirmative. So it happens that a ground can be found and adduced for everything, and a good ground, for example, a good motive for a tion, may affect something or may not, it may have a consequence or it may not. It becomes a motive, strictly so called, and affects something, e.g. through its reception into a will, there and there only it becomes a tive and is made a cause. b. Existence. Section 123. Existence is the immediate unity of reflection into self and reflection into other. It follows from this that existence is the indefinite multitude of existences reflected into themselves, which at the same time equally throw light upon one another, which, in short, are co-relative, and form a world of reciprocal dependence and of infinite interconnection between grounds and consequents. The grounds are themselves existences, and the existence in like manner are in many direct tions grounds as well as consequents. The phrase, existence, derived from existere, suggests the fact of having proceeded from something. Existence is being which has proceeded from the ground, and has reinstated by annulling its intermediation. The essence, as being set aside and absorbed, originally came before us as shining or showing in self, and the categories of this reflection are identity, difference and ground. The last is the unity of identity and difference, and because it unifies them it has at the same time to distinguish itself from itself. But that which is in this way distinguished from the ground is as little mere difference as the ground itself is abstract sameness. The ground works its own suspension, and when suspended, the result of its negation is existence. Having issued from the ground, existence contains the ground in it. The ground does not remain, as it were, behind existence, but by its very nature supersedes itself and translates itself into existence. Essence. 285. This is exemplified even in our ordinary mode of thinking when we look upon the ground of a thing, not as something abstractly inward, but as itself also an existent. For example, the lightning flash which has set a house on fire would be considered the ground of the conflagration, or the manners of a nation and the conditions of its life would be regarded as the ground of its constitution. Such indeed is the ordinary aspect in which the existence world originally appears to reflection, an indefinite crowd of things existent, which being simultaneously reflected on themselves and on one another are related reciprocally as ground and consequence. In this motley play of the world, if we may so call the sum of existence, there is nowhere a firm footing to be found. Everything bears an aspect of relativity, conditioned by and conditioning something else. The reflective understanding makes it its business to elicit and trace these connections running out in every direction, but the question touching an ultimate design is so far left unanswered, and therefore the craving of the reason after knowledge passes with the further development of the logical idea beyond this position of mere relativity. THINGINITSLF Section 124. The reflection on another of the existent is however inseparable from reflection into self. The ground is their unity, from which existence has issued. The existent therefore includes relativity, and has on its own part its multiple interconnections with other existence. It is reflected on itself as its ground. The existent is, when so described, a thing. The thing in itself, or thing in the abstract, so famous in the philosophy of Kant, shows itself here in its genesis. It is seen to be the abstract reflection on self, which is so clung to the exclusion of reflection into other things and of all predication of difference. The thing in itself therefore is the empty substratum for these predicates of relation. If to know means to comprehend an object in its concrete character, then the thing in itself, which is nothing but the quite abstract and indeterminate thing in general, must certainly be as unknowable as it is alleged to be. With as much reason, however, as we speak of the thing in itself, we might speak of quality by itself or quantity by itself, and of any other category. The expression would then serve to signify that these categories are taken in their abstract immediacy, apart from their development and inward character. It is no better than a whim of the 286. Hegel's logic. Understanding, therefore, if we attach the qualificatory in itself to the thing only. But this in itself is also applied to the facts of the mental as well as the natural world. As we speak of electricity or of a plant in itself, so we speak of man or the state in itself. By this, in itself, in these objects, we are meant to understand what they strictly and properly are. This usage is liable to the same criticism as the phrase, thing in itself. For if we stick to the mere, in itself, of an object, we apprehend it not in its truth, but in the inadequate form of mere abstraction. Thus the man, in himself, is the child. And what the child has to do is to rise out of this abstract and undeveloped, in himself, and become, for himself, what he is at first only, in himself, a free and reasonable being. Similarly, the state in itself is the yet I am mature and patriarchal state, where the various political functions, latent in the notion of the state, have not received the full logical constitution which the logic of political principles demands. In the same sense, the germ may be called the plant in itself. These examples may show the mistake of supposing that the thing in itself, of things is something inaccessible to our cognition. All things are originali in themselves, but that is not the end of the matter. As the germ, being the plant in itself, means self-development, so the thing in general passes beyond its in itself, the abstract reflection on self, to manifest itself further as a reflection on other things. It is this sense that it has properties. See, Tihi thing Properties Section 125, Alpha. The thing is the totality, the development in explicit unity of the categories of the ground and of existence. On the side of one of its factors, viz. reflection on other things, it has in it the differences, in virtue of which it is a characterized and concrete thing. These characteristics are different from one another. They have their reflection into self not on their own part, but on the part of the thing. They are properties of the thing, and their relation to the thing is expressed by the word, have. As a term of relation, to have takes the place of to be. True, somewhat has qualities on its part too, but this transference of having into the sphere of being is inexact, because the character as quality is directly one with the somewhat, and the somewhat ceases to be when it loses its quality. But the thing is reflection into self, for it is an identity which is also essence. 287. Distinct from the difference, i.e. from its attributes. In many languages, have is employed to denote past time. And with reason. For the past is absorbed or suspended being, and the mind is its reflection into self. In the mind only it continues to subsist, the mind, however, distinguishing from itself this being in it which has been absorbed or suspended. In the thing all the characteristics of reflection recur as existent. Thus the thing, in its initial aspect, as the thing by itself, is the selfsame or identical. But identity, it was proved, is not found without difference. So the properties, which the thing has, are the existent difference in the form of diversity. In the case of diversity of variety, each diverse member exhibited an indifference to every other, and they had no other relation to each other, save what was given by a comparison external to them. But now in the thing we have a bond which keeps the various properties in union. Property, besides, should not be confused with quality. No doubt, we also say, a thing has qualities. But the phraseology is a misplaced one, having hints at an independence, foreign to the somewhat, which is still directly identical with its quality. Somewhat is what it is only by its quality, whereas, though the thing indeed exists only as it has its properties, it is not confined to this or that definite property, and can therefore lose it, without ceasing to be what it is. Matters section 126, beta. Even in the ground, however, the reflection on something else is directly convertible with reflection on self. And hence the properties are not merely different from each other, they are also self-identical, independent, and relieved from their attachment to the thing. Still, as they are the characters of the thing distinguished from one another, as reflected into self, they are not themselves things, if things be concrete, but only existences reflected into themselves as abstract characters. They are what are called matters. Nor is the name, things, given to matters, such as magnetic and electric matters. They are qualities proper, a reflected being one with their being. They are the character that has reached immediacy, existence. They are entities. To elevate the properties, which the thing has, to the independent position of matters, or materials of which it consists, is a proceeding based upon the notion of a thing, and for that reason is also found in 288. Hegel's logic. Experience. Thought and experience, however, alike protest against concluding from the fact that certain properties of a thing, such as color or smell, may be represented as particular coloring or odorific matters, that we are then at the end of the inquiry, and that nothing more is needed to penetrate to the true secret of things than a disintegration of them into their component materials. This disintegration into independent matters is properly restricted to inorganic nature only. The chemist is in the right, therefore, when, for example, he analyzes common salt or gypsum into its elements, and finds that the former consists of muriatic acid and soda, the latter of sulfuric acid and calcium. So too the geologist does well to regard granite as a compound of quartz, felspar, and mica. These matters, again, of which the thing consists, are themselves partly things, which in that way may be once more reduced to more abstract matters. Sulfuric acid, for example, is a compound of sulfur and oxygen. Such matters or bodies can as a matter of fact be exhibited as subsisting by themselves, but frequently we find other properties of things, entirely wanting this self-subsistence, also regarded as particular matters. Thus we hear caloric and electrical or magnetic matters spoken of. Such matters are at the best figments of understanding. And we see here the usual procedure of the abstract reflection of understanding. Capriciously adopting sin-glay categories, whose value entirely depends on their place in the gradual evolution of the logical idea, it employs them in the pretended interests of explanation, that in the face of plain, unprejudiced perception and experience, so as to trace back to them every object investigated. Nor is this all. The theory, which makes things consist of independent matters, is frequently applied in a region where it has neither meaning nor force. For within the limits of nature even, wherever there is organic life, this category is obviously inadequate. An animal may be said to consist of bones, muscles, nerves, etc. But evidently we are here using the term consist in a very different sense from its use when we spoke of the piece of granite as consisting of the above-mentioned elements. The elements of granite are utterly indifferent to their combination, they could subsist as well without it. The different parts and members of an organic body on the contrary subsist only in their union. They cease to exist as such, when they are separated from each other. Section 127. Thus matter is the mere abstract or indeterminate reflection into something else, or reflection into self at the same time as determinate, it. Essence. 289. As consequently thinghood, which then and there is the subsistence of the thing. By this means the thing has on the part of the matters its reflection into self, the reverse of section 125, it subsists not on its own part, but consists of the matters, and is only a superficial association between them, an external combination of them. FORM section 128, gamma, matter, being the immediate unity of existence with itself, is also indifferent toward specific character. Hence the numerous diverse matters coalesce into the one matter, or into existence under the reflective characteristic of identity. In contrast to this one matter, these distinct properties and their external relation which they have to one another in the thing, constitute the form, the reflective category of difference, but a difference which exists and is a totality. This one featureless matter is also the same as the thing in itself was. Only the latter is intrinsically quite abstract, while the former essentially implies relation to something else, and in the first place to the form. The various matters of which the thing consists are potentially the same as one another. Thus we get one matter in general to which the difference is expressly attached externally and as a bare form. This theory, which holds things all round to have one and the same matter at bottom, and merely to differ externally in respect of form, is much in vogue with the reflective understanding. Matter in that case counts for naturally indeterminate, but susceptible of any determination, while at the same time it is perfectly permanent, and continues the same amid all change and alteration. And in finite things at least this disregard of matter for any determinate form is certainly exhibited. For example, it matters not to a block of marble, whether it receive the form of this or that statue or even the form of a pillar. Be it noted however that a block of marble can disregard form only relatively, that is, in reference to the sculptor, it is by no means purely formless. And so the mineralogist considers the relatively formless marble as a special formation of rock, differing from other equally special formations, such as sandstone or porphyry. Therefore we say it is an abstraction of the understanding which isolates matter into a certain natural formlessness. For properly speaking the thought of matter includes the principle of form throughout, and no formless matter therefore a p pairs, anywhere even in experience is existing. Still the conception of matter as original and pre-existent, and as naturally formless, is a very 290. Hegel's logic. Ancient one. It meets us even among the Greeks, at first in the mythical shape of chaos, which is supposed to represent the unformed substratum of the existing world. Such a conception must of necessity tend to make God not the creator of the world, but a mere world molder or demiurge. A deeper insight into nature reveals God as creating the world out of nothing. And that teaches two things. On the one hand it enunciates that matter, as such, has no independent subsistence, and on the other that the form does not supervene upon matter from without, but as a totality involves the principle of matter in itself. This free and infinite form will hereafter come before us as the notion. Section 129. Thus the thing suffers a disruption into matter and form. Each of these is the totality of thinghood and subsists for itself. But matter, which is meant to be the positive and indeterminate existence, contains, as an existence, reflection on another, every whit as much as it contains self-enclosed being. Accordingly, as uniting these characteristics, it is itself the totality of form. But form, being a complete whole of characteristics, ipso facto involves reflection into self. In other words, as self-relating form it has the very function attributed to matter. Both are at bottom the same. Invest them with this unity, and you have the relation of matter and form, which are also no less distinct. Theoryof, ma tt or s, section 130. The thing, being this totality, is a contradiction. On the side of its negative unity it is form in which matter is determined and deposed to the rank of properties, section 125. At the same time it consists of matters, which in the reflection of the thing into itself are as much independent as they are at the same time negative. Thus the thing is the essential existence, in such a way as to be an existence that suspends or absorbs itself in itself. In other words, the thing is an appearance or phenomenon. The negation of the several matters, which is insisted on in the thing no less than their independent existence, occurs in physics as porosity. Each of the several matters, colored matter, odorific matter, and if we believe some people, even sound matter, not excluding caloric, electric matter, etc., is also negated. And in this negation of theirs, or as interpenetratting their pores, we find the numerous other independent matters. Essence. 291. Which, being similarly porous, make room in turn for the existence of the rest. Pores are not empirical facts. They are figments of the understanding, which uses them to represent the element of negation in independent matters. The further working out of the contradictions is concealed by the nebulous imbroglio in which all matters are independent and all no less negated in each other. If the faculties or activities are similarly hypostatized in the mind, their living unity similarly turns to the imbroglio of an action of the one on the others. These pores, meaning thereby not the pores in an organic body, such as the pores of wood or of the skin, but those in the so-called matters, such as coloring matter, caloric, or metals, crystals, etc., cannot be verified by observation. In the same way matter itself, furthermore form which is separated from matter, whether that be the thing as consisting of matters, or the view that the thing itself subsists and only has proper ties, is all a product of the reflective understanding which, while it observes and professes to record only what it observes, is rather creating a metaphysic, bristling with contradictions of which it is unconscious. Second subdivision of essence B appearance section 131 The essence must appear or shine forth. Its shining or reflection in it is the suspension and translation of it to immediacy, which, while as reflection into self it is matter or subsistence, is also form, reflection on something else, a subsistence which sets itself aside. To show or shine is the characteristic by which essence is distinguished from being, by which it is essence, and it is this show which, when it is developed, shows itself, and is appearance. Essence accordingly is not something beyond or behind appearance, but, just because it is the essence which exists, the existence is appearance, forth shining. Existence stated explicitly in its contradiction is appearance. But appearance, forth showing, is not to be confused with a mere show, shining. Show is the proximate truth of being or immediacy. The immediate, instead of being, as we suppose, something independent, resting on its own self, is a mere show, and as such it is packed or summed up under the simplicity of the immanent essence. The essence is, in the first place, the sum total of the showing itself, shining. 292. Hegel's logic. In itself, inwardly, but, far from abiding in this inwardness, it comes as a ground forward into existence, and this existence being grounded not in itself, but on something else, is just appearance. In our imagination we ordinarily combine with the term appearance or phenomenon the conception of an indefinite congeries of things existing, the being of which is purely relative, and which consequently do not rest on a foundation of their own, but are esteemed only as passing stages. But in this conception it is no less implied that essence does not linger behind or beyond appearance. Rather it is, we may say, the infinite kindness which lets its own show freely issue into immediacy, and graciously allows it the joy of existence. The appearance which is thus created does not stand on its own feet, and has its being not in itself but in something else. God, who is the essence, when he lends existence to the passing stages of his own show in himself, may be described as the goodness that creates the world. But he is also the power above it, and the righteousness, which manifests the merely phenomenal character of the content of this existing world, whenever it tries to exist in independence. Appearance is in every way a very important grade of the logical idea. It may be said to be the distinction of philosophy from ordinary consciousness that it sees the merely phenomenal character of what the latter supposes to have a self-subsistent being. The significance of appearance, however, must be properly grasped, or mistakes will arise. To say that anything is mere appearance may be misinterpreted to mean that, as compared to what is merely phenomenal, there is greater truth in the immediate, in that which is. Now, in strict fact, the case is precisely the reverse. Appearance is higher than mere being, a richer category because it holds in combination the two elements of reflection into self and reflection into other, whereas being, our immediacy, is still mere relationlessness, and apparently rests upon itself alone. Still, to say that anything is only an appearance suggests a real flaw, which consists in this, that appearance is still divided against itself and without intrinsic stability. Beyond and above mere appearance comes in the first place actuality, the third grade of essence, of which we shall afterwards speak. In the history of modern philosophy, Kant has the merit of first rehabilitating this distinction between the common and the philosophic modes of thought. He stopped halfway, however, when he attached to appearance a subjective meaning only, and put the abstract essence. Essence. 293. Immovable outside it is the thing in itself beyond the reach of our cognition. For it is the very nature of the world of immediate objects to be appearance only. Knowing it to be so, we know at the same time, the essence, which, far from staying behind or beyond the appearance, rather manifests its own essentiality by deposing the world to a mere appearance. One can hardly quarrel with the plain man who, in his desire for totality, cannot acquiesce in the doctrine of subjective idealism, that we are solely concerned with phenomena. The plain man, however, in his desire to save the objectivity of Knoll Edge, may very naturally return to abstract immediacy and maintain that immediacy to be true and actual. In a little work published under the title A Report, clear as day, to the larger public touching the proper nature of the latest philosophy, an attempt to force the reader to understand, Fichte examined the opposition between subjective idealism and mediate consciousness in a popular form, under the shape of a dialogue between the author and the reader, and tried hard to prove that the subjective idealist's view was right. In this dialogue the reader complains to the author that he has completely failed to place himself in the idealist's position, and is inconsolable in the thought that things around him are not real things but mere appearances. The affliction of the reader can scarcely be blamed when he is expected to consider himself hemmed in by an impervious circle of purely subjective conceptions. Apart from this subjective view of appearance, however, we have all reason to rejoice that the things which environ us are appearances and not steadfast and independent existences, since in that case we should soon perish of hunger, both bodily and mental. The world of appearances, section 132. The apparent or phenomenal exists in such a way that its subsistence is ipso facto thrown into abeyance or suspended and is only one stage in the form itself. The form embraces in it the matter or subsistence as one of its characteristics. In this way the phenomenal has its ground in this form, as its essence, its reflection into self in contrast with its immediacy, but, in so doing, has it only in another aspect of the form. This ground of its is no less phenomenal than itself, and the phenomenon accordingly goes on to an endless mediation of subsistence by means of form, and thus equally by non-subsistence. This endless intermediation is 294. Hegel's logic. At the same time a unity of self-relation, and existence is developed into a totality, into a world of phenomena, of reflected finitude. B. Content and form, section 133. Outside one another as the phenomena in this phenomenal world are, they form a totality, and are wholly contained in their self-relatedness. In this way the self-relation of the phenomenon is completely specified, it has the form in itself, and because it is in this identity, has it as essential subsistence. So it comes about that the form is content, and in its phase is the law of the phenomenon. When the form, on the contrary, is not reflected into self, it is equivalent to the negative of the phenomenon, to the non-independent and changeable, and that sort of form is the indifferent or external form. The essential point to keep in mind about the opposition of form and content is that the content is not formless, but has the form in its own self, quite as much as the form is external to it. There is thus a doubling of form. At one time it is reflected into itself, and then is identical with the content. At another time it is not reflected into itself, and then it is external existence, which does not at all affect the content. We are here in presence, implicitly, of the absolute correlation of content and form, viz. their reciprocal revulsion, so that content is nothing but the revulsion of form into content, and form nothing but the revulsion of content into form. This mutual revulsion is one of the most important laws of thought. But it is not explicitly brought out before the relations of substance and causality. Form and content are a pair of terms frequently employed by the reflective understanding, especially with a habit of looking on the content as the essential and independent, the form on the contrary as the unessential and dependent. Against this it is to be noted that both are in fact equally essential, and that, while a formless content can be as little found as a formless matter, the two, content and matter, are distinguished by this circumstance, that matter, though implicitly not without form, still in its existence manifests a disregard of form, whereas the content, as such, is what it is only because the matured form is included in it. Still the form still suffers from externality. In a book, for instance, it certainly has no bearing upon the content, whether it be written or printed, bound in paper or in leather. That essence. 295. However, does not in the least imply that apart from such an indifferent and external form, the content of the book is itself formless. There are undoubtedly books enough which even in reference to their content may well be styled formless, but want of form in this case is the same as bad form, and means the defect of the right form, not the absence of all form whatever. So far is this right form from being unaffected by the content that it is rather the content itself. A work of art that wants the right form is for that very reason no right or true work of art, and it is a bad way of excusing an artist to say that the content of his works is good and even excellent, though they want the right form. Real works of art are those where content and form exhibit a thorough identity. The content of the Iliad, it may be said, is the Trojan War, and especially the wrath of Achilles. In that we have everything, and yet very little after all, for the Iliad is made an Iliad by the poetic form, in which that content is molded. The content of Romeo and Juliet may similarly be said to be the ruin of two lovers through the discord between their families, but something more is needed to make Shakespeare's immortal tragedy. In reference to the relation of form and content in the field of science, we should recollect the difference between philosophy and the rest of the sciences. The latter are finite, because their mode of thought, as a merely formal act, derives its content from without. Their content therefore is not known as molded from within through the thoughts which lie at the ground of it, and form and content do not thoroughly interpenetrate each other. This partition disappears in philosophy, and thus justifies its title of infinite knowledge. Yet even philosophic thought is often held to be a merely formal act, and that logic, which confessedly deals only with thoughts qua thoughts, is merely formal, is especially a foregone conclusion. And if content means no more than what is palpable and obvious to the senses, all philosophy and logic in particular must be at once acknowledged to be void of content, that is to say, of content perceptible to the senses. Even ordinary forms of thought, however, and the common usage of language, do not in the least restrict the appellation of content to what is perceived by the senses, or to what has a being in place and time. A book without content is, as everyone knows, not a book with empty leaves, but one of which the content is as good as none. We shall find as the last result on closer analysis, that by what is called content an educated mind means nothing but the presence and power of thought. But this is to admit that thoughts are not empty forms without affinity to their content, and that in other spheres as well as in. 296. Hegel's logic. Art, the truth and the sterling value of the content essentially depend on the content showing itself identical with the form. Section 134. But immediate existence is a character of the subsistence itself as well as of the form. It is consequently external to the character of the content. But in an equal degree this externality, which the content has through the factor of its subsistence, is essential to it. When thus explicitly stated, the phenomenon is relativity or correlation, where one and the same thing, viz., the content or the developed form, is seen as the externality and antithesis of independent existences, and as their reduction to a relation of identity in which identification alone the two things distinguished are what they are. C. Relation or correlation. Section 135. Alpha. The immediate relation is that of the whole and the parts. The content is the whole, and consists of the parts, the form, its counterpart. The parts are diverse from one another. It is they that possess independent being. But they are parts, only when they are identified by being related to one another, or, in so far as they make up the whole, when taken together. But this together is the counterpart and negation of the part. Essential correlation is the specific and completely universal phase in which things appear. Everything that exists stands in correlation, and this correlation is the veritable nature of every existence. The existent thing in this way has no being of its own, but only in something else. In this other, however, it is self-relation, and correlation is the unity of the self-relation in relation to others. The relation of the whole and the parts is untrue to this extent, that the notion and the reality of the relation are not in harmony. The notion of the whole is to contain parts, but if the whole is taken and made what its notion implies, i.e. if it is divided, it at once ceases to be a whole. Things there are no doubt, which correspond to this relation, but for that very reason they are low and untrue existences. We must remember, however, what untrue signifies. When it occurs in a philosophical discussion, the term untrue does not signify that the thing to which it is applied is non-existent. A bad state or a sickly body may exist all the same, but these. Essence. 297. Things are untrue, because their notion and their reality are out of harmony. The relation of whole and parts, being the immediate relation, comes easy to reflective understanding, and for that reason it often satisfies when the question really turns on profounder ties. The limbs and organs, for instance, of an organic body are not merely parts of it. It is only in their unity that they are what they are, and they are unquestionably affected by that unity, as they also in turn affect it. These limbs and organs become mere parts, only when they pass under the hands of an anatomist, whose occupation, be it remembered, is not with the living body but with the corpse. Not that such analysis is illegitimate. We only mean that the external and mechanical relation of whole and parts is not sufficient for us, if we want to study organic life in its truth. And if this be so in organic life, it is the case to a much greater extent when we apply this relation to the mind in the formations of the spiritual world. Psychologists may not expressly speak of parts of the soul or mind, but the mode in which this subject is treated by the analytic understanding is largely founded on the analogy of this finite relation. At least that is so, when the different forms of mental activity are enumerated and described merely in their isolation one after another, as so-called special powers and faculties. FORCEANDTHEXPRESSIONOFFORCE Section 136, beta, the one and same of this correlation, the self-relation found in it, is thus immediately a negative self-relation. The correlation is in short the mediating process whereby one and the same is first unaffected towards difference, and secondly is the negative self-relation, which repels itself as reflection into self to difference, and invests itself, as reflection into something else, with existence, whilst it conversely leads back this reflection into other to self-relation and indifference. This gives the correlation of force and its expression, Ausserung. The relationship of whole and part is the immediate and therefore unintelligent, mechanical, relation, a revulsion of self-identity into mere variety. Thus we pass from the whole to the parts, and from the parts to the whole. In the one we forget its opposition to the other, while each on its own account, at one time the whole, at another the parts, is taken to be an independent existence. In other words, when the parts are declared to subsist in the whole, and the whole to consist of the parts, we have either member of the relation at different times taken to 298. Hegel's logic. Be permanently subsistent, while the other is non-essential. In its superficial form the mechanical nexus consists in the parts being independent of each other and of the whole. This relation may be adopted for the progression ad infinitum, in the case of the divisibility of matter, and then it becomes an unintelligent alternation with the two sides. A thing at one time is taken as a whole. Then we go on to specify the parts. This specifying is forgotten, and what was a part is regarded as a whole. Then the specifying of the part comes up again, and so on forever. But if this infinity be taken as the negative which it is the negative self-relating element in the correlation, force, the self-identical whole, or immanency, which yet supersedes this immanency and gives itself expression, and conversely the expression which vanishes and returns into force. Force, notwithstanding this infinity, is also finite, for the content, or the one and the same of the force and its outputting, as this identity at first only for the observer. The two sides of the relation are not yet, each on its own account, the concrete identity of that one and same, not yet the totality. For one another they are therefore different, and the relationship is a finite one. Force consequently requires solicitation from without. It works blindly, and on account of this defectiveness of form, the content is also limited and accidental. It is not yet genuinely identical with the form. Not yet is it as a notion in an end. That is to say, it is not intrinsically and actually determinate. This difference is most vital, but not easy to apprehend. It will assume a clearer formulation when we reach design. If it be overlooked, it leads to the confusion of conceiving God as force, a confusion from which Herder's God especially suffers. It is often said that the nature of force itself is unknown and only its manifestation apprehended. But, in the first place, it may be replied, every article in the import of force is the same as what is specified in the expression, and the explanation of a phenomenon by a force is a mere tautology. What is supposed to remain unknown, therefore, is really nothing but the empty form of reflection into self, by which alone the force is distinguished from the expression, and that form too is something familiar. It is a form that does not make the slightest addition to the content and to the law, which have to be discovered from the phenomenon alone. Another assurance always given is that to speak of forces implies no theory as to their nature, and that being so, it is impossible to see why the form of force has been introduced into the sciences at all. In the second place, the nature of force is undoubtedly unknown. We are still without any necessity binding an essence. 299. Connecting its content together in itself, as we are without necessity in the content, in so far as it is expressly limited and hence has its character by means of another thing outside it. 1. Compared with the immediate relation of whole and parts, the relation between force and its putting forth may be considered infinite. In it that identity of the two sides is realized, which in the former relation only existed for the observer. The whole, though we can see that it consists of parts, ceases to be a whole when it is divided, whereas force is only shown to be force when it exerts itself, and in its exercise only comes back to itself. The exercise is only force once more. Yet, on further examination even this relation will appear finite, and finite in virtue of this mediation, just as, conversely, the relation of whole and parts is obviously finite in virtue of its immediacy. The first and simplest evidence for the finitude of the mediated relation of force in its exercise is, that each and every force is conditioned and requires something else than itself for its subsistence. For instance, a special vehicle of magnetic force, as is well known, is iron, the other proper ties of which, such as its color, specific weight, or relation to acids, are independent of this connection with magnetism. The same thing is seen in all other forces, which from one end to the other are found to be conditioned and mediated by something else than themselves. Another proof of the finite nature of force is that it requires solicitation before it can put itself forth. That through which the force is solicited, is itself another expression of force, which cannot put itself forth without similar solicitation. This brings us either to a repetition of the infinite progression, or to a reciprocity of soliciting and being solicited. In either case we have no absolute beginning of motion. Force is not as yet, like the final cause, inherently self-determining. The content is given to it as determined, and force, when it exerts itself, is, according to the phrase, blind in its working. That phrase implies the distinction between abstract force manifestation and teleological action. 2. The oft-repeated statement, that the exercise of the force and not the force itself admits of being known, must be rejected as groundless. It is the very essence of force to manifest itself, and thus in the totality of manifestation, conceived as a law, we at the same time discover the force itself. And yet this assertion that force in its own self is unknowable betrays a well-grounded presentiment that this relation is finite. The several manifestations of a force at first meet us in indefinite multiplicity, and in their isolation seem accidental. But, reducing this multiplicity to its inner unity, which we term force, we see that the apparently contingent is necessary, by recognizing the law that rules it. But the different forces themselves are a multiplicity again, and in their 300. Hegel's logic. Mere juxtapositions seem to be contingent. Hence in empirical physics, we speak of the forces of gravity, magnetism, electricity, etc., and in psychology of the forces of memory, imagination, will, and all the other faculties. All this multiplicity again excites a craving to know these different forces as a single whole, nor would this craving be appeased even if the several forces were traced back to one common primary force. Such a primary force would be really no more than an empty abstraction, with as little content as the abstract thing in itself. And besides this, the correlation of force and manifestation is essentially a mediated correlation, of reciprocal dependence, and it must therefore contradict the notion of force to view it as primary or resting on itself. Such being the case with the nature of force, though we may consent to let the world be called a manifestation of divine forces, we should object to have God himself viewed as a mere force. For force is after all a subordinate and finite category. At the so-called Renaissance of the sciences, when steps were taken to trace the single phenomena of nature back to underlying forces, the Church branded the enterprise as impious. The argument of the Church was as follows. If it be the forces of gravitation, of vegetation, etc., which occasion the movements of the heavenly bodies, the growth of plants, etc., there is nothing left for divine providence, and God sinks to the level of a lay surely onlooker, surveying this play of forces. The students of nature, it is true, and Newton more than others, when they employed the reflective category of force to explain natural phenomena, have expressly pleaded that the honor of God, as the creator and governor of the world, would not thereby be impaired. Still the logical issue of this explanation by means of forces is that the inferential understanding proceeds to fix each of these forces, and to maintain them in their finitude as ultimate. And contrasted with this de infinitized world of independent forces and matters, the only terms in which it is possible still to describe God will present him in the abstract infinity of an unknowable supreme being in some other world far away. This is precisely the position of materialism, and of modern free thinking, whose theology ignores what God is and restricts itself to the mere fact that he is. In this dispute, therefore, the Church and the religious mind have to a certain extent the right on their side. The finite forms of understanding certainly fail to fulfill the conditions for a knowledge either of nature or of the formations in the world of mind as they truly are. Yet on the other side it is impossible to overlook the formal right which, in the first place, entitles the empirical sciences to Vindi. Essence. 301. Kate the right of thought to know the existent world in all the speciality of its content, and to seek something further than the bare statement of mere abstract faith that God created and governs the world. When our religious consciousness, resting on the authority of the Church, teaches us that God created the world by his almighty will, that he guides the stars in their courses, and vouchsafes to all his creatures their existence and their well-being, the question why is still left to answer. Now it is the answer to this question which forms the common task of empirical science and of philosophy. When religion refuses to recognize this problem, or the right to put it, and appeals to the unsearchableness of the decrees of God, it is taking up the same agnostic ground as is taken by the mere enlightenment of understanding. Such an appeal is no better than an arbitrary dogmatism, which contravenes the express command of Christianity, to know God in spirit and in truth, and is prompted by a humility which is not Christian, but born of ostentatious bigotry. Section 137 Force is a whole, which is in its own self-negative self-relation, and as such a whole it continually pushes itself off from itself and puts itself forth. But since this reflection into another, corresponding to the distinction between the parts of the whole, is equally a reflection into self, this outputting is the way and means by which force that returns back into itself is as a force. The very act of outputting accordingly sets in abeyance the diversity of the two sides which is found in this correlation, and expressly states the identity which virtually constitutes their content. The truth of force and utterance therefore is that relation, in which the two sides are distinguished only as outward and inward. Section 138. Gamma. The inward, interior, is the ground, when it stands as the mere form of the one side of the appearance in the correlation, the empty form of reflection into self. As a counterpart to it stands the outward, exterior, existence, also as form of the other side of the correlation, with the empty characteristic of reflection into something else. But inward and outward are identified, and their identity is identity brought to fullness in the content, that unity of reflection into self and reflection into other which was forced to appear in the movement of force. Both are the same one identity, and this unity makes them the content. 302. Hegel's logic. Section 139. In the first place then, exterior is the same content as interior. What is inwardly is also found outwardly, and vice versa. The appearance shows nothing that is not in the essence, and in the essence there is no thing but what is manifested. Section 140. In the second place, inward and outward, as formal terms, are also reciprocally opposed, and that thoroughly. The one is the abstraction of identity with self, the other mere multiplicity or reality. But as stages of the one form, they are essentially identical, so that whatever is at first explicitly put only in the one abstraction, is also plainly and at one step in the other. Therefore what is only internal is also only external, and what is only external, is so far only at first internal. It is the customary mistake of reflection to take essence to be merely the interior. If it be so taken, even this way of looking at it is purely external, and that sort of essence is the empty external abstraction. Ins innere der Natur drinkt kein Schaffner Geist, zu glücklich wenn nur der äußere Schall weist. It ought rather to have been said that, if the essence of nature is ever described as the inner part, the person who so describes it only knows its outer shell. In being as a whole, or even in mere sense perception, the notion is at first only an inward, and for that very reason is something external to being, a subjective thinking and being, devoid of truth. In nature as well as in mind, so long as the notion, design, or law are at first the inner capacity, mere possibilities, they are first only an external, inorganic nature, the knowledge of a third person, alien force, and the like. As a man is outwardly, that is to say in his actions, not of course in his merely bodily outwardness, so he is inwardly, and if his virtue, morality, etc. are only inwardly his, that is if they exist only in his intentions and sentiments, and his outward acts are not identical with them, the one half of him is as hollow and empty as the other. The relation of outward and inward unites the two relations that precede, and at the same time sets in abeyance mere relativity and phenomenality in general. Yet so long as understanding keeps the essence. 303. Ward and outward fixed in their separation, they are empty forms, the one as null as the other. Not only in the study of nature, but also of the spiritual world, much depends on a just appreciation of the relation of inward and outward, and especially on avoiding the misconception that the former only is the essential point on which everything turns, while the latter is unessential and trivial. We find this mistake made when, as is often done, the difference between nature and mind is traced back to the abstract difference between inner and outer. As for nature, it certainly is in the gross external, not merely to the mind, but even on its own part. But to call it external in the gross is not to imply an abstract externality, for there is no such thing. It means rather that the idea which forms the common content of nature in mind, is found in nature as outward only, and for that very reason only inward. The abstract understanding, with its either or, may struggle against this conception of nature. It is none the less obviously found in our other modes of consciousness, particularly in religion. It is the lesson of religion that nature, no less than the spiritual world, is a revelation of God, but with this distinction, that while nature never gets so far as to be conscious of its divine essence, that consciousness is the express problem of the mind, which in the matter of that problem is as yet finite. Those who look upon the essence of nature as mere inwardness, and therefore inaccessible to us, take up the same line as that ancient creed which regarded God as envious and jealous, a creed which both Plato and Aristotle pronounced against long ago. All that God is, he imparts and reveals, and he does so at first in and through nature. Any object indeed is faulty and imperfect when it is only inward, and thus at the same time only outward, or, which is the same thing, when it is only an outward and thus only an inward. For instance, a child, taken in the gross as human being, is no doubt a rational creature, but the reason of the child as child is at first a mere inward, in the shape of his natural ability or vocation, etc. This mere inward, at the same time, has for the child the form of a mere outward, in the shape of the will of his parents, the attainments of his teachers, and the whole world of reason that environs him. The education and instruction of a child aim at making him actually and for himself what he is at first only potentially and therefore for others, viz., for his grown-up friends. The reason, which at first exists in the child only as an inner possibility, is actualized through education, and conversely, the child by these means becomes conscious that the goodness, religion, and science which he had at first looked upon as an outward authority, are his own nature. As with the child so it is in this matter with the adult, when, in a posy. 304. Hegel's logic. On to his true destiny, his intellect and will remain in the bondage of the natural man. Thus, the criminal sees the punishment to which he has to submit as an act of violence from without, whereas in fact the penalty is only the manifestation of his own criminal will. From what has now been said, we may learn what to think of a man who, when blamed for his shortcomings, or, it may be, his discreditable acts, appeals to the, professedly, excellent intentions and sentiments of the inner self he distinguishes therefrom. There certainly may be individual cases where the malice of outward circumstances frustrates well-meant designs, and disturbs the execution of the best-laid plans. But in general, even here the essential unity between inward and outward is maintained. We are thus justified in saying that a man is what he does, and the lying vanity which consoles itself with the feeling of inward excellence may be confronted with the words of the gospel, "By their fruits ye shall know them." That grand saying applies primarily in a moral and religious aspect, but it also holds good in reference to performances in art and science. The keen eye of a teacher who perceives in his pupil decided evidences of talent may lead him to state his opinion that a Raphael or a Mozart lies hidden in the boy, and the result will show how far such an opinion was well founded. But if a daub of a painter, or a poetaster, soothe themselves by the conceit that their head is full of high ideas, their consolation is a poor one, and if they insist on being judged not by their actual works but by their projects, we may safely reject their pretensions as unfounded and unmeaning. The converse case, however, also occurs. In passing judgment on men who have accomplished something great and good, we often make use of the false distinction between inward and outward. All that they have accomplished, we say, is outward merely. Inwardly they were acting from some very different motive, such as a desire to gratify their vanity or other unworthy passion. This is the spirit of envy. Incapable of any great action of its own, envy tries hard to depreciate greatness and to bring it down to its own level. Let us, rather, recall the fine expression of Goethe, that there is no remedy but love against great superiorities of others. We may seek to rob men's great actions of their grandeur, by the insinuation of hypocrisy, but, though it is possible that men in an instance now and then may dissemble and disguise a good deal, they cannot conceal the whole of their inner self, which infallibly betrays itself in the decursus vitae. Even here it is true that a man is nothing but the series of his actions. What is called the pragmatic writing of history has in modern times frequently sinned in its treatment of great historical characters and a essence. 305. Faced and tarnished the true conception of them by this fallacious separation of the outward and the inward. Not content with telling the unvarnished tale of the great acts which have been wrought by the heroes of the world's history, and with acknowledging that their inward being corresponds with the import of their acts, the pragmatic historian fancies himself justified and even obliged to trace the supposed secret motives that lie behind the open facts of the record. The historian, in that case, is supposed to write with more depth in proportion as he succeeds in tearing away the aureole from all that has been heretofore held grand and glorious, and in depressing it, so far as its origin and proper significance are concerned, to the level of vulgar mediocrity. To make these pragmatic researches in history easier, it is usual to recommend the study of psychology, which is supposed to make us acquainted with the real motives of human actions. The psychology in question, however, is only that petty knowledge of men, which looks away from the essential and permanent in human nature to fasten its glance on the casual and private features shown in isolated instincts and passions. A pragmatic psychology ought at least to leave the historian, who investigates the motives at the ground of great actions, a choice between the substantial interests of patriotism, justice, religious truth, and the like, on the one hand, and the subjective and formal interests of vanity, ambition, avarice, and the like, on the other. The latter, however, are the motives which must be viewed by the pragmatist as really efficient, otherwise the assumption of a contrast between inward, the disposition of the agent, and the outward, the import of the action, would fall to the ground. But inward and outward have in truth the same content, and the right doctrine is the very reverse of this pedantic judiciality. If the heroes of history had been actuated by subjective and formal interests alone, they would never have accomplished what they have. And if we have due regard to the unity between the inner and the outer, we must own that great men willed what they did, and did what they willed. Section 141. The empty abstractions, by means of which the one identical content perforce continues in the two correlatives, suspend themselves in the immediate transition, the one into the other. The content is itself nothing but their identity, section 138, and these abstractions are the seeming of sense, put as seeming. By the manifestation of force the inward is put into existence, but this putting is the mediation by empty abstractions. In its own self the intermediating process vanishes to the immediacy, in 306. Hegel's logic, which the inward and the outward are absolutely identical and their difference is distinctly no more than assumed and imposed. This identity is actuality. Second subdivision of essence. See actuality. Section 142. Actuality is the unity, become immediate, of essence with existence, or of inward with outward. The utterance of the actual is the actual itself. So that in this utterance it remains just as essential, and only as essential, in so far as it is immediate external existence. We have ere this met being and existence as forms of the immediate. Being is, in general, unreflected immediacy and transition into another. Existence is immediate unity of being and reflection, hence appearance, it comes from the ground, and falls to the ground. In actuality this unity is explicitly put, and the two sides of the relation identified. Hence the actual is exempted from transition, and its externality is its energizing. In that energizing it is reflected into itself, its existence is only the manifestation of itself, not of another. Existsb no tral. Actuality and thought, or idea, are often absurdly opposed. How commonly we hear people saying that, though no objection can be urged against the truth and correctness of a certain thought, There is nothing of the kind to be seen in reality, or it cannot be actually carried out. People who use such language only prove that they have not properly apprehended the nature either of thought or of actuality. Thought in such a case is, on the one hand, the synonym for a subjective conception, plan, intention, or the like, just as actuality, on the other, is made synonymous with external and sensible existence. This is all very well in common life, where great laxity is allowed in the categories and the names given to them, and it may of course happen that, e.g., the plan, or so-called idea, say, of a certain method of taxation, is good and advisable in the abstract, but that nothing of the sort is found in so-called actuality, or could possibly be carried out under the given conditions. But when the abstract understanding gets hold of these categories and exaggerates the distinction they imply into a hard essence. 307. And fast line of contrast, when it tells us that in this actual world we must knock ideas out of our heads, it is necessary energetically to protest against these doctrines, alike in the name of science and of sound reason. For on the one hand ideas are not confined to our heads merely, nor is the idea, on the whole, so feeble as to leave the question of its actualization or non-actualization dependent on our will. The idea is rather the absolutely active as well as actual. Thea court ulisral, and on the other hand actuality is not so bad and irrational, as pure blind or wrong-headed and muddle-brained would-be reformers imagine. So far as actuality, as distinguished from mere appearance, and primarily presenting a unity of inward and outward, from being in contrariety with reason, that it is rather thoroughly reasonable, and everything which is not reasonable must on that very ground cease to be held actual. The same view may be traced in the usages of educated speech, which declines to give the name of real poet or real statesman to a poet or a statesman who can do nothing really meritorious or reasonable. In that vulgar conception of actuality which mistakes for what is palpable and directly obvious to the senses, we must seek the ground of a widespread prejudice about the relation of the philosophy of Aristotle to that of Plato. Popular opinion makes the difference to be as follows. While Plato recognizes the idea and only the idea as the truth, Aristotle, rejecting the idea, keeps to what is actual, and is on that account to be considered the founder and chief of empiricism. On this it may be remarked, that it is not the vulgar actuality of what is immediately at hand, but the idea as actuality. Where then lies the controversy of Aristotle against Plato? It lies in this. Aristotle calls the Platonic idea a mere dynamism, and establishes in opposition to Plato that the idea, which both equally recognize to be the only truth, is essentially to be viewed as an energia, in other words, as the inward which is quite to the fore, or as unity of inner and outer, or as actuality, in the emphatic sense here given to the word. Actualitiysconcr at E section 143. Such a concrete category as actuality includes the characteristics aforesaid in their difference, and is therefore also the development of 308. Hegel's logic. Them, in such a way that, as it has them, they are at the same time plainly understood to be a show, to be assumed or imposed. Possibility. Alpha. Viewed as an identity in general, actuality is first of all possibility, the reflection into self which, as in contrast with the concrete unity of the actual, is taken and made an abstract and unessential essentiality. Possibility is what is essential to reality, but in such a way that it is at the same time only a possibility. It was probably the import of possibility which induced Kant to regard it along with necessity and actuality as modalities, since these categories do not in the least increase the notion as object, but only express its relation to the faculty of knowledge. For possibility is really the bare abstraction of reflection into self, what was formerly called the inward, only that it is now taken to mean the external inward, lifted out of reality and with the being of a mere supposition, and is thus, sure enough, supposed only as a bare modality, an abstraction which comes short and, in more concrete terms, belongs only to subjective thought. It is otherwise with actuality and necessity. They are anything but a mere sort and mode for something else, in fact the very reverse of that. If they are supposed, it is as the concrete, but not merely suppositions, but intrinsically complete. As possibility is, in the first instance, the mere form of identity with self, as compared with the concrete which is actual, the rule for it merely is that a thing must not be self-contradictory. Thus everything is possible, for an act of abstraction can give any content this form of identity. Everything however is as impossible as it is possible. In every content, which is and must be concrete, the speciality of its nature may be viewed as a specialized contrariety and in that way as a contradiction. Nothing therefore can be more meaningless than to speak of such possibility and impossibility. In philosophy in particular, there should never be a word said of showing that it is possible, or there is still another possibility, or, to adopt another phraseology, it is conceivable. The same consideration should warn the writer of history against employing a category which has now been explained to be on its own merits, untrue, but the subtlety of essence. 309. The empty understanding finds its chief pleasure in the fantastic ingenuity of suggesting possibilities in lots of possibilities. Possibleanda court our picture thought is at first disposed to see in possibility the richer and more comprehensive, in actuality the poorer and narrower category. Everything, it is said, is possible, but everything which is possible is not on that account actual. In real truth, however, if we deal with them as thoughts, actuality is the more comprehensive, because it is the concrete thought which includes possibility as an abstract element. And that superiority is to some extent expressed in our ordinary mode of thought when we speak of the possible, in distinction from the AC tool, as only possible. Possibility is often said to consist in a thing's being thinkable. Think, however, in this use of the word, only means to conceive any content under the form of an abstract identity. Now, every content can be brought under this form, since nothing is required except to separate it from the relation in which it stands. Hence, any content, however absurd and nonsensical, can be viewed as possible. It is possible that the moon may fall upon the earth tonight, for the moon is a body separate from the earth and may as well fall down upon it as a stone thrown into the air does. In language like this about possibilities, it is chiefly the law of sufficient ground or reason which is manipulated in the style already explained. Everything, it is said, is possible, for which you can state some ground. The less education a man has, or in other words, the less he knows of the specific connection of the objects to which he directs his observations, the greater is his tendency to launch out into all sorts of empty possibilities. An instance of this habit in the political sphere is seen in the pothouse politician. In practical life, too, it is no uncommon thing to see ill will and indolence slink behind the category of possibility, in order to escape definite obligations. To such conduct the same remarks apply as were made in connection with the law of sufficient ground. Reasonable and practical men refuse to be imposed upon by the possible, for the simple ground that it is possible only. They stick to the actual, not meaning by that word merely whatever immediately is now and here. Many of the proverbs of common life express the same contempt for what is abstractly possible. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. 310. Hegel's logic. E versus Ythingispossible. After all, there is as good reason for taking everything to be impossible as to be possible, for every content, a content is always concrete, includes not only diverse but even opposite characteristics. Nothing is so impossible, for instance, as this, that I am, for I is at the same time simple self-relation and, as undoubtedly, relation to something else. The same may be seen in every other fact in the natural or spiritual world. Matter, it may be said, is impossible, for it is the unity of attraction and repulsion. The same is true of life, law, freedom. Generally speaking, it is the empty understanding which haunts these empty forms, and the business of philosophy in the matter is to show how null and meaningless they are. Whether a thing is possible or I am possible, depends altogether on the subject matter. That is, on the sum total of the elements in actuality, which, as it opens itself out, discloses itself to be necessity. Contingency, ACCDENTS, section 144, beta. But the actual in its distinction from possibility, which is reflection into self, as only the outward concrete, the unessential immediate. In other words, to such extent as the actual is primarily the simple merely immediate unity of inward and outward, it is obviously made an uns sential outward, and thus at the same time it is merely inward, the abstraction of reflection into self. Hence it is itself characterized as a merely possible. When thus valued at the rate of a mere possibility, the actual is a contingent or accidental, and, conversely, possibility is mere accident itself or chance. Possibilityandscontingency section 145 possibility and contingency are the two factors of actuality, inward and outward, put as mere forms which constitute the externality of the actual. They have their reflection into self on the body of actual fact, our content, with its intrinsic definitiveness which gives essential ground of their characterization. The finitude of the contingent in the possible lies, therefore, as we now see, in the distinction of the form determination from the content. And, therefore, it depends on the content alone whether anything is contingent and possible. Essence. 311. Free-will is possibility is the mere inside of actuality, it is for that reason a mere outside actuality, in other words, contingency. The contingent, roughly speaking, is what has the ground of its being not in itself but in somewhat else. Such is the aspect under which actuality first comes before consciousness, and which is often mistaken for actuality itself. But the contingent is only one side of the actual, the side namely, of reflection on somewhat else. It is the actual, in the signification of something merely possible. Accordingly we consider the contingent to be what may or may not be, what may be in one way or another, whose being or not being, and whose being in this way or otherwise, depends not upon itself but on something else. To overcome this contingency is, roughly speaking, the problem of science on the one hand, as in the range of practice, on the other. The end of action is to rise above the contingency of the will, or above ca price. It has however often happened, most of all in modern times, that contingency has been unwarrantably elevated, and has a value attached to it, both in nature and in the world of the mind, to which it has no just claim. Frequently, nature, to take it first, has been chiefly admired for the richness and variety of its structures. Apart however from what disclosure it contains of the idea, this richness gratifies none of the higher interests of reason, and its vast variety of structurish, organic and inorganic, affords us only the spectacle of a contingency losing itself in vagueness. At any rate, the checkered scene presented by the several varieties of animals and plants, conditioned as it is by outward circumstances, the complex changes in configuration and grouping of clouds, and the like, ought not to be ranked higher than the equally casual fancies of the mind which surrenders itself to its own caprices. The wonderment with which such phenomena are welcomed is a most abstract frame of mind, from which one should advance to a closer insight into the inner harmony and uniformity of nature. Of contingency in respect of the will, it is especially important to form a proper estimate. The freedom of the will is an expression that often means mere free choice, or the will in the form of contingency. Freedom of choice, or the capacity for determining ourselves towards one thing or another, is undoubtedly a vital element in the will, which is in its very notion free, but instead of being freedom itself, it is only in the first instance a freedom in form. The genuinely free will, which includes free choice, is suspended, as conscious to itself that its content is intrinsically firm and fast, and knows it at the same time to be Thor. 312. Hegel's logic. Wholly its own. A will, on the contrary, which remains standing on the grade of option, even supposing it does decide in favor of what is in import right and true, is always haunted by the conceit that it might, if it had so pleased, have decided in favor of the reverse course. When more narrowly examined, free choice is seen to be a contradiction, to this extent, that its form and content stand in antithesis. The matter of choice is given, and known as a content dependent not on the will itself, but on outward circumstances. In reference to such a given content, freedom lies only in the form of choosing, which, as it is only a freedom in form, may consequently be regarded as freedom only in supposition. On an ultimate analysis, it will be seen that the same outwardness of circumstances, on which is founded the content that the will finds to its hand, can alone account for the will giving its decision for the one and not the other of the two alternatives. Although contingency, as it has thus been shown, is only one aspect in the whole of actuality, and therefore not to be mistaken for the whole of actuality, and therefore not to be mistaken for actuality itself, it has no less than the rest of the forms of the idea its due office in the world of objects. This is, in the first place, seen in nature. On the surface of nature, so to speak, chance ranges unchecked, and the contingency must simply be recognized, without the pretension sometimes erroneously ascribed to philosophy, in seeking to find it in it could only be so and not otherwise. Nor is contingency less visible in the world of mind. The will, as we have already remarked, includes contingency under the shape of option or free choice, but only as a vanishing and abrogated element. In respect of mind and its works, just as in the case of nature, we must guard against being so far misled by a well-meant endeavor after rational knowledge, as to try to exhibit the necessity of phenomena which are marked by a decided contingency, or, as the phrase is, to construe them a priori. Thus in language, although it be, as it were, the body of thought, chance still unquestionably plays a decided part, and the same is true of the creations of law, of art, etc. The problem of science, and especially of philosophy, undoubtedly consists in eliciting the necessity concealed under the semblance of contingency. That, however, is far from meaning that the contingent belongs to our subjective conception alone, and must therefore be simply set aside, if we wish to get at the truth. All scientific researches which pursue this tendency exclusively lay themselves open to the charge of mere jugglery and an overstrained precisionism. Essence. 313. Condition section 146. When more closely examined, what the aforesaid outward side of a situality implies is this. Contingency, which is actuality in its immediacy, is the self-identical, essentially only as a supposition which is no sooner made than it is revoked and leaves an existent externality. In this way, the external contingency is something presupposed, the immediate existence of which is at the same time a possibility, and has the vocation to be suspended, to be the possibility of something else. Now this possibility is the condition. The contingent, as the immediate actuality, is at the same time the possibility of somewhat else, no longer however, the abstract possibility which we had at first, but the possibility which is. And a possibility existent is a condition. By the condition of a thing we mean first, an existence, in short an immediate, and secondly the vocation of this immediate to be suspended and subserve the actualizing of something else. Immediate actuality is in general as such never what it ought to be. It is a finite actuality with an inherent flaw, and its vocation is to be consumed. But the other aspect of actuality is its essentiality. This is primarily the inside which as a mere possibility is no less destined to be suspended. Possibility thus suspended is the issuing of a new actuality, of which the first immediate actuality was the presupposition. Here we see the alternation which is involved in the notion of a condition. The conditions of a thing seem at first sight to involve no bias any way. Really, however, an immediate actuality of this kind includes in it the germ of something else altogether. At first, this something else is only a possibility, but the form of possibility is soon suspended and translated into actuality. This new actuality thus issuing is the very inside of the immediate actuality which uses it up. Thus, there comes into being quite another shape of things, and yet it is not another, for the first actuality is only put as what it in essence was. The conditions which are sacrificed, which fall to the ground and are spent, only unite with themselves in the other actuality. Such in general is the nature of the process of actuality. The actual is no mere case of immediate being, but, as essential being, a suspension of its own immediacy, and thereby mediating itself with itself. 314. Hegel's logic. Ralphosibility section 147, gamma. When this externality, of actuality, is thus developed into a circle of the two categories of possibility and immediate actuality, showing the intermediation of the one by the other, it is what is called real possibility. Being such a circle, further, it is the totality, and thus the content, the AC tool fact or affair in its all-round definiteness. While in like manner, if we look at the distinction between the two characteristics in this unity, it really is the concrete totality of the form, the immediate self-translation of inner into outer, and of outer into inner. This self-movement of the form is activity, carrying into effect the fact or affair as a real ground which is self-suspended to actuality, and carrying into effect the contingent actual ity, the conditions, i.e. it is their reflection into self, and their self-suspension to another actuality of the actual fact. If all the conditions are at hand, the fact, event, must be actual, and the fact itself is one of the conditions, for being in the first place only inner, it is in fact itself only presupposed. Developed actuality, as the coincident alternation of inner and outer, the alternation of their opposite motions combined into a single motion, is necessity. Necessity has been defined, and rightly so, as the union of possibility and actuality. This mode of expression, however, gives a superficial and therefore unintelligible description of the very difficult notion of Nice's city. It is difficult because it is the notion itself, only that its stages or factors are still as actualities, which are yet at the same time to be viewed as forms only, collapsing and transient. In the two following paragraphs, therefore, an exposition of the factors which constitute necessity must be given at greater length. Blindnecessity. When anything is said to be necessary, the first question we ask is, why? Anything necessary accordingly comes before us as something due to a supposition, the result of certain antecedents. If we go no further than mere derivation from antecedents, however, we have not gained a complete notion of what necessity means. What is merely derivative, is what it is, not through itself, but through something else. And in this way, it too is merely contingent. What is necessary on the essence? 315. Other hand, we would have to be what it is through itself, and thus, although derivative, it must still contain the antecedent whence it is derived as a vanishing element in itself. Hence we say of what is necessary, it is. We thus hold it to be simple, self-relation, in which all dependence on something else is removed. Necessity is often said to be blind. If that means that in the process of necessity the end or final cause is not explicitly and overtly present, the statement is correct. The process of necessity begins with the existence of scattered circumstances which appear to have no interconnection and no concern one with another. These circumstances are an immediate actuality which collapses, and out of this negation a new actuality proceeds. Here we have a content which in point of form is doubled, once as content of the final realized fact, and once as content of the scattered circumstances which appear as if they were positive, and make themselves at first felt in that character. The latter content is in itself not and is accordingly inverted into its negative, thus becoming content of the realized fact. The immediate circumstances fall to the ground as conditions, but are at the same time retained as content of the ultimate reality. From such circumstances and conditions there has, as we say, proceeded quite another thing, and it is for that reason that we call this process of necessity blind. If on the contrary we consider teleological action, we have in the end of action a content which is already foreknown. This activity therefore is not blind but seeing. To say that the world is ruled by providence implies that design, as what has been absolutely predetermined, is the active principle, so that the issue corresponds to what has been foreknown and forewilled. The theory, however, which regards the world as determined through necessity and the belief in a divine providence are by no means mutuo ally excluding points of view. The intellectual principle underlying the idea of divine providence will hereafter be shown to be the notion. But the notion is the truth of necessity, which it contains in suspension in itself, just as, conversely, necessity is the notion implicit. Necessity is blind only so long as it is not understood. There is no thing therefore more mistaken than the charge of blind fatalism made against the philosophy of history, when it takes for its problem to understand the necessity of every event. The philosophy of history rightly understood takes the rank of a theodicy, and those, who fancy they honor divine providence by excluding necessity from it, are really degrading it by this exclusiveness to a blind and irrational price. In the simple language of the religious mind which speaks of God's eternal and immutable decrees, there is implied an express rec. 316. Hegel's logic. Ignition that necessity forms part of the essence of God. In his difference from God, man, with his own private opinion and will, follows the call of caprice and arbitrary humor, and thus often finds his acts turn out something quite different from what he had meant and willed. But God knows what he wills, is determined in his eternal will neither by accident from within nor from without, and what he wills he also accomplishes, irresistibly. Necessity gives a point of view which has important bearings upon our sentiments and behavior. When we look upon events as necessary, our situation seems at first sight to lack freedom completely. In the creed of the ancients, as we know, necessity figured as destiny. The modern point of view, on the contrary, is that of consolation. And consolation means that, if we renounce our aims and interests, we do so only in prospect of receiving compensation. Destiny, on the contrary, leaves no room for consolation. But a close examination of the ancient feeling about destiny will not by any means reveal a sense of bondage to its power. Rather the reverse. This will clearly appear, if we remember that the sense of bondage springs from inability to surmount the antithesis, and from looking at what is, and what happens, as contradictory to what ought to be and happen. In the ancient mind, the feeling was more of the following kind: because such a thing is, it is, and as it is, so ought it to be. Here there is no contrast to be seen, and therefore no sense of bondage, no pain, and no sorrow. True, indeed, as already remarked, this attitude towards destiny is void of consolation. But then, on the other hand, it is a frame of mind which does not need consolation, so long as personal subjectivity has not acquired its infinite significance. It is this point on which special stress should be laid in comparing the ancient sentiment with that of the modern and Christian world. By subjectivity, however, we may understand, in the first place, only the natural and finite subjectivity, with its contingent and arbitrary content of private interests and inclinations, all, in short, that we call person is distinguished from thing. Taking thing, in the emphatic sense of the word, in which we use the correct expression that it is a question of things and not of persons. In this sense of subjectivity we cannot help admiring the tranquil resignation of the ancients to deitiny, and feeling that it is a much higher and worthier mood than that of the moderns, who obstinately pursue their subjective aims, and when they find themselves constrained to resign the hope of reaching them, console themselves with the prospect of a reward in some other shape. But the term subjectivity is not to be confined merely to the essence. 317. Bad and finite kind of it which is contrasted with the thing, fact. In its truth subjectivity is immanent in the fact, and as a subjectivity thus infinite is the very truth of the fact. Thus regarded, the doctrine of consolation receives a newer and a higher significance. It is in this sense that the Christian religion is to be regarded as the religion of consolation, and even of absolute consolation. Christianity, we know, teaches that God wishes all men to be saved. That teaching declares that subjectivity has an infinite value. And that consoling power of Christianity just lies in the fact that God himself is in it, known as the absolute subjectivity, so that, inasmuch as subjectivity involves the element of particularity, our particular personality too is recognized not merely as something to be solely and simply nullified, but as at the same time something to be preserved. The gods of the ancient world were also, it is true, looked upon as personal, but the personality of a Zeus and an Apollo is not a real personality, it is only a figure in the mind. In other words, these gods are mere personifications, which, being such, do not know themselves, and are only known. An evidence of this defect and this powerlessness of the old gods is found even in the religious beliefs of antiquity. In the ancient creeds not only men, but even gods, were represented as subject to destiny, a destiny which we must conceive as necessity not unveiled, and thus as something wholly impersonal, selfless, and blind. On the other hand, the Christian God is God not known merely but also self-knowing. He is a personality not merely figured in our minds, but rather absolutely a tool. We must refer to the philosophy of religion for a further discussion of the points here touched. But we may note in passing how important it is for any man to meet everything that befalls him with the spirit of the old proverb which describes each man as the architect of his own fortune. That means that it is only himself after all of which a man has the usufruct. The other way would be to lay the blame of whatever we experience upon other men, upon unfavorable circumstances, and the like. And this is a fresh example of the language of unfreedom, and at the same time the spring of discontent. If man saw, on the contrary, that whatever happens to him is only the outcome of himself, and that he only bears his own guilt, he would stand free, and in everything that came upon him would have the consciousness that he suffered no wrong. A man who lives in displease with himself and his lot commits much that is perverse and amiss, for no other reason than because of the false opinion that he is wronged by others. No doubt too there is a great deal of chance in what befalls us. But the chance has its root in the natural man. So long, however, as a man is otherwise conscious. 318. Hegel's logic. That he is free, his harmony of soul and peace of mind will not be destroyed by the disagreeables that befall him. It is their view of Nietzsche's necessity, therefore, which is at the root of the discontent of men, and which in that way determines their destiny itself. THEPROCESSOFNECESSITY section 148. Among the three elements in the process of necessity, the condition, the fact, and the activity. A. The condition is alpha. What is presupposed or antestated, i.e. it is not only supposed or stated, and so only a correlative to the fact, but also prior, and so independent, a contingent and external circumstance which exists without respect to the fact. While thus contingent, however, this presupposed or antestated term, in respect with all of the fact, which is the totality, is a complete circle of conditions. Beta. The conditions are passive, and used as materials for the fact, into the content of which they thus enter. They are likewise intrinsically conformable to this content, and already contain its whole characteristic. B. The fact is also, alpha, something presupposed or antestated, i.e. it is at first, and is supposed, only inner and possible, and also, being prior, as independent content by itself. Beta. By using up the conditions, it receives its external existence, the realization of the articles of its content, which reciprocally correspond to the conditions, so that while it presents itself out of these as the facts, it also proceeds from them. C. The activity similarly has, alpha, an independent existence of its own, as man, a character, and at the same time it is possible only where the conditions are in the fact. Beta. It is the movement which translates the conditions into fact, and the latter into the former is the side of existence, are rather the movement which educes the fact from the conditions in which it is potentially present, and which gives existence to the fact by abolishing the existence possessed by the conditions. In so far as these three elements stand to each other in the shape of independent existences, this process has the aspect of an outward necessity. Outward necessity has a limited content for its fact. For the fact is this whole, in phase of singleness. But since in its form this whole is essence. 319. External to itself, it is self-externalized even in its own self and in its content, and this externality, attaching to the fact, is a limit of its content. THECIRCLEOFCIRCUMSTANCES Section 149 Necessity, then, is potentially the one essence, self-same, but not full of content, in the reflected light of which its distinctions take the form of independent realities. This self-sameness is at the same time, as absolute form, the activity which reduces into dependency and mediates into I am mediacy. Whatever is necessary is through another, which is broken up into mediating ground, the fact and the activity, and an immediate actuality, or accidental circumstance, which is at the same time a condition. The necessary, being through another, is not in and for itself, hypothetical, it is a mere result of assumption. But this intermediation is just as immediate however as the abrogation of itself. The ground and contingent condition is translated into immediacy, by which that dependency is now lifted up into actuality, and the fact has closed with itself. In this return to itself, the necessary simply and positively is, as unconditioned actuality. The necessary is so, mediated through a circle of circumstances. It is so, because the circumstances are so, and at the same time it is so, unmediated. It is so, because it is. The R relationship of substantiality Section 150 The necessary is in itself an absolute correlation of elements, i.e. the process developed, in the preceding paragraphs, in which the correlation also suspends itself to absolute identity. In its immediate form it is the relationship of substance and accident. The absolute self-identity of this relationship as substance is such, which as necessity gives the negative to this form of inwardness, and thus invests itself with actuality, but which also gives the negative to this outward thing. In this negativity, the actual, as immediate,